The slap echoed through the room like a gunshot, a sharp, vicious crack of a grown man's palm striking a woman who sat alone and unmoving. It was the kind of sound that didn't just interrupt a conversation. It murdered the very atmosphere of the room. In an instant, the rowdy, alcohol-fueled energy of Delaney's bar and grill vanished, replaced by a vacuum of absolute, terrified silence. A small bead of blood bloomed at the corner of the woman's lip, dark and stark against her pale skin. Her head had been snapped to the side by the force of the blow, but she didn't collapse. She didn't cry out. She didn't even raise a hand to her face. Instead, she slowly, with a deliberate and terrifying grace, turned her head back to face the man who had struck her. Her eyes were not filled with the tears of a victim or the wide-eyed shock of the intimidated. They were cold, flat, and ancient, like something dangerous had just been nudged awake behind a veil of ice. Staff Sergeant Tyler Mason stood over her, his chest heaving, his face flushed with the toxic cocktail of cheap whiskey and unearned ego. He had no idea what he had just done. He looked around at his friends, seeking the approval he was used to receiving, but for the first time that night, the grins were faltering. The air in the bar had grown heavy, thick with the sudden realization that the world had just shifted on its axis. No one in that room truly understood the caliber of the woman sitting on that cracked vinyl stool, but they were all about to receive a masterclass in the consequences of arrogance. If you've ever wondered what happens when a man who thinks he's a predator encounters something that actually sits at the very top of the food chain, stay with me. This story isn't just about a bar fight. It's about the ghosts we carry and the moment they decide to stop being hauntings and start being warnings. The storm had come in fast off the Pacific that Friday night, a wall of gray and black that swallowed the California coastline in minutes. It was the kind of weather that felt personal, the rain hitting the windows of Delaney's in hard, sideways sheets that rattled the glass in its frames. Outside, the world was a blurred mess of wind and water, but inside, the neon Budweiser sign flickered with a rhythmic hum, casting a sickly red glow over the pool tables and the faded military photos that lined the walls. Delaney's wasn't a place you went to be seen. It was a place you went to disappear. Situated just a couple of miles outside the main gate of Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, it had served generations of men and women who knew the weight of a rucksack and the cost of a long deployment. The floor was scuffed by 1,000 pairs of combat boots, and the air always smelled faintly of stale beer, old grease, and the kind of quiet desperation that only service members truly understand. Rachel Kane sat at the far end of the bar, as far from the center of gravity as she could get. She was 38 years old, though in the dim, forgiving light of the bar, she might have passed for 30. Her face was a landscape of sharp angles and lean muscle, her skin toughened by years of squinting into the sun of high-altitude deserts and the salt spray of the open ocean. There were fine lines at the corners of her eyes, not the lines of laughter, but the lines of a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades looking for threats on horizons most people didn't even know existed. She wore an oversized olive-drab hoodie, the sleeves pushed up just enough to reveal forearms that were corded with functional, wiry strength. Her hands, resting loosely on the wood of the bar, were steady as stone. She had driven 40 minutes through the worsening storm to get here. Her apartment in San Diego had started to feel like a cage, the silence inside it too loud to bear. 3 weeks ago, she had formally separated from the United States Navy after 17 years of continuous service. 17 years of living by a watch and a set of orders. 17 years of being a weapon in the hands of a government that didn't always know where to point her. Now, she was a civilian, a word that felt like a foreign language she couldn't quite master. She had ordered a water, no ice, no lemon, because she knew better than anyone how easily the darkness could find a way in through the neck of a bottle. She just wanted to sit in a room where people understood the silence. But the silence was being systematically dismantled by the group of men in the back. There were 6 of them, maybe 7, and they carried themselves with the loud, performative bravado of soldiers who were young enough to believe they were invincible and drunk enough to try and prove it. Rachel didn't need to see their IDs to know who they were. She recognized the haircuts, the way their civilian clothes hung awkwardly on bodies meant for tactical nylon, and the specific vibrating energy of special operations. They were Rangers, likely out of the 75th, though it didn't really matter. She'd worked alongside their kind in valleys in the Hindu Kush and on rooftops in Ramadi. She knew their strengths, and she knew their flaws. Right now, their primary flaw was a complete lack of situational awareness. The noise from their table grew, a cacophony of barked laughter and the rhythmic thumping of fists on wood. They were celebrating something, a successful training cycle, a birthday, or perhaps just the fact that they were alive. But as the night wore on, their attention began to drift toward the woman sitting alone at the end of the bar. "Bro, she's been sitting there for an hour," one of them said, his voice carrying easily over the jukebox's low hum. "She's depressing the whole vibe. Someone needs to go cheer her up." "Tyler, you're the charmer," another added, shoving a man in a tight t-shirt. "Go on, show us that legendary Ranger hospitality." Tyler Mason grinned, a flash of white teeth and pure, unadulterated confidence. He was a staff sergeant, a man who had led squads through hell and back, and he wasn't used to being ignored. He stood up, his movements slightly loose from the beer, and began the walk across the bar. It was a walk designed to be noticed, shoulders back, chin up, the stride of a man who owned every square inch of the room. He slid onto the stool next to Rachel with a practiced ease, invading her personal space before he'd even spoken a word. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on those shoulders, darlin'," he said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. "And that's a pretty rough night to be drinking nothing but tap water. Why don't you let me get you something with a little more kick? My treat." Rachel didn't turn her head. She picked up her glass, took a slow, measured sip of the water, and set it back down in the exact center of its condensation ring. "I'm good, thanks," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact. Tyler chuckled, leaning closer. The smell of whiskey and stale smoke rolled off him in waves. "Come on now, don't be like that. It's Friday night. The world's ending outside, and we're all friends here. I'm Tyler." "I'm sure you are," Rachel replied, still looking straight ahead at the rows of bottles behind the bar. "And I'm sure you're very good at whatever it is you do, but I'd like to be left alone." The air between them changed instantly. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Tyler's smile didn't disappear, but it morphed, losing its warmth and gaining a jagged, predatory edge. He wasn't used to being dismissed, especially not by a woman sitting alone in a dive bar. He could feel his friends watching him, their eyes boring into his back, waiting to see if he'd falter. "That's a little rude, don't you think?" Tyler said, his voice hardening. "I'm trying to be a gentleman here. I'm trying to have a conversation." "I'm not trying to be rude," Rachel said, finally turning her head to look at him. Her gaze was heavy, possessing a weight that seemed to catch him off guard for a split second. "I'm trying to be clear. I have no interest in a conversation. Please go back to your friends." It was the please that did it. Not because it was a plea, but because it was delivered with the same clinical detachment one might use to tell a child to stop playing with their food. It was a dismissal of his entire persona. Tyler's face darkened, a vein in his temple beginning to throb. The collective grin of the men at the back table had turned into a series of expectant stares. They wanted blood, or at least a victory. "You think you're better than everyone in here?" Tyler hissed, leaning in so close that Rachel could see the broken capillaries in his eyes. "You sit here with your little hoodie and your water, acting like you're some mystery. You're not a mystery. You're just a lonely woman who doesn't know how to say thank you." "Staff Sergeant," Rachel said. The word hit him like a physical blow. He froze, his mouth slightly open. "What? That's your rank," she said, her eyes scanning him with a speed and precision that made him feel suddenly naked. "Army. Ranger Battalion. You've got the posture of a man who's spent too much time in a harness and the ego of a man who hasn't been told no since he earned his tab. You're currently representing your unit very poorly. For the last time, go back to your table." For a moment, the world stood still. Tyler Mason was trapped between the shock of being identified and the humiliation of being lectured. He looked back at his table. His men were leaning forward, their faces a mask of derisive anticipation. If he walked away now, he'd never hear the end of it. He'd be the man who got put in his place by a woman in a hoodie. In his head, the logic of the drunk and the arrogant took over. He needed to reclaim the room. He needed to assert the hierarchy he believed in. He didn't think, he just reacted. He reached out and slapped her, a full-force, open-handed strike that rang out through the bar. The sound of the impact was sickening. Rachel's head snapped to the left, her hoodie slipping back just enough to reveal the sharp line of her jaw. The room went into a state of shock that was deeper than anything that had come before. Cobb, the bartender, a man who had seen everything from bar-room brawls to mortar fire, froze with a glass in his hand, his eyes widening. He had intended to step in if things got loud, but this had escalated beyond a mere argument. Rachel didn't move for several seconds. She remained perfectly still, her head turned away. Then very slowly she brought her hand up to her mouth. She dabbed at the corner of her lip with a single finger, looked at the red smear of blood, and then turned back to Tyler. Her expression hadn't changed, but the energy coming off her had. It was no longer the energy of a woman who wanted to be left alone. It was the energy of a predator that had just decided the hunt was on. "I'm going to give you one chance," she said. Her voice was a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the bar, cutting through the silence like a razor. "One, take your people and walk out that door. Right now, if you do, this ends here." Tyler Mason laughed, though there was a tremor in it he couldn't quite hide. "You're going to give me a chance? Are you kidding me? Look at you, you're lucky I don't." "One chance," she repeated. Behind Tyler, the dynamic of the group had changed. One man, a sergeant first class named Dominic Hale, had stood up. Unlike the others, Hale had seen real combat in places where the rules of engagement were written in blood. He was older, grimmer, and his instincts were screaming at him. He was looking at the way Rachel was sitting, the way her feet were planted, the way her center of gravity was perfectly balanced even on a bar stool. He saw the lack of fear in her eyes, and it terrified him. "Tyler," Hale called out, his voice sharp. "Tyler, back off, let's go, now." But Tyler was too far gone. He was deep in the hole he'd dug for himself, and he thought the only way out was to dig deeper. "Stay out of it, Dom. This bitch thinks she's—" Rachel moved. It wasn't a scramble or a frantic burst of energy. It was a blur of economy and violence. One second she was on the stool, and the next she was inside Tyler's guard. Before his brain could even process that she had stood up, she had his right wrist in a grip that felt like a hydraulic vise. She didn't pull him. She used his own momentum against him, pivoting her hips and applying a downward pressure on his joint that sent a white-hot spike of agony through his arm. Tyler made a sound, a high-pitched, strangled gasp, as his knees hit the sawdust-covered floor. He tried to swing with his other hand, but Rachel wasn't there. She moved with a fluid, terrifying speed, stepping around his strike and driving the heel of her palm into his bicep, deadening the limb instantly. "Don't," she said, her voice calm and steady as she looked over Tyler's slumped form at the men rushing toward her. Dominic Hale stopped dead 3 feet away. He saw the way she held Tyler, not with effort, but with a casual, terrifying control. 2 other Rangers, younger and more reckless, didn't have Hale's seasoned caution. They charged from the side, thinking they could overwhelm her with sheer mass. Rachel released Tyler, allowing him to collapse onto the floor, and met the first man's charge. She didn't meet him with force. She met him with physics. She stepped into his space, her forearm catching him across the chest and redirecting his weight. As he stumbled, she delivered a short, sharp elbow to his solar plexus. The air left his lungs in a sudden, violent burst, and he folded like a piece of paper, hitting the ground with a dull thud. The second man tried to grab her from behind, his arms reaching for her waist. Rachel didn't even look back. She dropped her weight, grabbed his reaching arm, and performed a standing shoulder throw that sent the 200-pound Ranger flying over her. He slammed into the edge of the bar with a sound of breaking wood and groaning lungs before sliding into a heap of limbs on the floor. In less than 5 seconds, 3 elite soldiers were on the ground, and Rachel Kane hadn't even broken a sweat. She stood in the center of the clearing she had made, her hoodie slightly ruffled, her breathing as regular as a ticking clock. She looked at Dominic Hale, who was standing with his hands half raised, not in an act of aggression, but in a desperate gesture of peace. "That's enough," Hale said, his voice shaking. "We're done. We're leaving." Rachel didn't say a word. She watched him, her eyes tracking every muscle in his face, every shift of his weight. She was waiting for the threat to reappear, but Hale was smart enough to know that the threat had already been realized. He reached down and grabbed Tyler by the collar of his shirt, dragging him toward the door. The other 2 men on the floor were groaning, slowly beginning to realize that their world had just been dismantled. Rachel stepped back toward the bar. She reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled something out. She didn't throw it. She set it down on the wood with a soft, metallic click. It was a coin, heavy and matte black, with an insignia that few people in the world would ever recognize. An eagle, an anchor, and a crossed rifle and pistol, arranged in a specific, haunting geometry. She looked at Cobb, the bartender, who was staring at her with a mixture of awe and something that looked very much like respect. "For the damage," she said, gesturing to the scuffed floor and the dented bar rail. "On the house," Cobb whispered, his voice cracking. "Everything, it's on the house." Rachel nodded once, a sharp, professional acknowledgement. She picked up her water glass, finished the last of the contents, and set it down. She didn't look back at the Rangers who were currently stumbling out into the rain, their pride left behind in the sawdust. She walked toward the door, her gait steady and purposeful, and vanished into the storm. Inside the bar, the silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a tomb. Dominic Hale had stayed behind for a split second, his eyes locked on the coin sitting on the bar. He walked over, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch it. He didn't pick it up at first, he just stared at the insignia. He had heard stories, whispers in the mess halls at Fort Bragg and late-night rumors in the barracks at Benning, about a unit that didn't exist, a group of operators who were recruited from the best of the best and then erased from the books. They were the ones who went into the places where the sun didn't shine to do the things that the world couldn't know about. He picked up the coin. It was heavier than it looked, made of a dense, non-reflective alloy. On the back there were no words, only a set of coordinates and a single stylized letter C. "What is that?" one of the younger Rangers asked, limping back inside, clutching his ribs. "Who was that bitch, Dom?" "Shut up," Hale said, his voice a low growl. "Just shut up. You have no idea what you just did. None of you do. She's just a girl, man. She got lucky," the younger man complained, though his face was pale with pain. Hale turned on him, his eyes burning with a sudden, fierce intensity. "She didn't get lucky. She didn't even use 10% of what she knows. Did you see her eyes? Did you see how she moved? She wasn't fighting us. She was managing us like we were children." He held up the coin. "Do you know what this is? This is a Naval Special Warfare Development coin. But not just any unit. This is from a Tier 1 element so black it doesn't have a name. It's a ghost unit." The room seemed to shrink. Even the locals at the other end of the bar, who had been watching the spectacle with detached interest, suddenly looked away as if the very knowledge of the coin was dangerous. "Tyler slapped a ghost," Hale whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "God help us all." Outside, the rain was a deafening roar against the roof of Rachel's truck. She sat in the driver's seat, the engine idling, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the deluge. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, and focused on her breathing. 4 counts in, hold for 2, 4 counts out. She could feel the adrenaline beginning to recede, leaving behind the cold, hollow ache she had lived with for years. She hadn't wanted this. She had tried everything in her power to avoid it. But the world had a way of finding her, a way of dragging her back into the violence she had tried to leave behind. She looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The blood on her lip had dried, a small, dark crust that felt like a brand. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a burner, a device she kept for reasons she didn't like to dwell on. She didn't recognize the number, but she knew the area code. It was a D.C. line. She didn't answer it. She put the truck in gear and pulled out of the parking lot, the tires splashing through the deep puddles. She needed to get home. She needed to find a way to quiet the noise in her head. But deep down, in the part of her that still functioned like a radar, she knew that the night was far from over. The slap in the bar was just the first pebble in an avalanche. Back at Delaney's, Dominic Hale was still staring at the coin. He had realized something as he turned the metal over in his hand. The coordinates on the back weren't for a military base or a government building. They were for a small, anonymous cemetery in Virginia, the place where the unit's dead were buried, the men and women who had officially ceased to exist long before their hearts stopped beating. He looked at Tyler, who was sitting on the curb outside in the rain, his head in his hands. Tyler was a good soldier, a brave man in his own right, but he was a man of the world. He understood rank and structure and the rules of engagement. He didn't understand the shadows. He didn't understand that there were people who lived in the spaces between the light, people for whom a slap wasn't an insult, but a trigger for a level of violence that was almost mathematical in its precision. Hale pulled out his phone and began to type. He wasn't calling his CO. He wasn't calling the MPs. He was calling a man he had met once in a windowless room in Landstuhl, a man who had told him that if he ever saw something he couldn't explain, something that felt like it belonged to the other side, he should reach out. "I found one," Hale whispered into the phone when the call was finally picked up. "At a bar outside Pendleton, she's out in the wild." The voice on the other end was silent for a long time, the only sound the hiss of static. "Did she leave a mark?" Hale looked at the coin on the bar. "She left a coin, and 3 of my men are on the floor." "Describe her," the voice commanded. As Hale began to speak, the storm outside reached its crescendo, the wind howling through the eaves of the old bar. In that moment, the lives of everyone in that room were irrevocably tied to the woman in the green hoodie. They didn't know her name, and they didn't know her history, but they knew her power. And as Rachel Kane drove into the dark, She knew that the 17 years she had tried to put behind her were just beginning to catch up. The drive back to her apartment was a blur of gray asphalt and the rhythmic thumping of the wipers. Rachel's mind was a tactical map, automatically plotting exits, identifying trailing vehicles, and analyzing the interaction at the bar. It was an exhausting way to live, a neurological tax she paid for her survival. She tried to think about something else, anything else. She thought about the garden she wanted to start on her small balcony. She thought about the book on ancient history she had started reading. But the image of Tyler Mason's face, the moment his palm hit her cheek, kept flashing back like a strobe light. It wasn't the pain that bothered her. She had endured far worse: broken bones, shrapnel, the searing heat of a nearby blast. It was the arrogance of it, the casual, unthinking way he had decided that she was a target. It was a reminder that no matter how far she ran, no matter how many miles she put between herself and the theater of war, the world would always see her as something to be poked, prodded, and tested. She reached her apartment complex, a nondescript building that offered the anonymity she craved. She parked the truck, checked her mirrors one last time, and stepped out into the rain. The cold water was a relief, washing away the heat of the bar and the metallic tang of the adrenaline. She made her way to her door, her keys already in her hand, her thumb hovering over the panic button on her fob. Inside, the apartment was exactly as she had left it: clean, sparse, and devoid of any personal touches that might betray who she was. There were no photos on the walls, no trophies on the shelves. The only furniture was a comfortable chair, a small table, and a bed that she kept made with military precision. She walked to the bathroom, flipped on the light, and stared at herself in the mirror. The bruise was already beginning to form, a faint, mottled shadow on her cheekbone. She touched it, her fingers light and clinical. Then she opened the medicine cabinet and pulled out a small, waterproof case. Inside was a satellite phone, a piece of equipment she hadn't touched since the day she'd signed her discharge papers. She looked at it for a long time, the blue light of the screen reflecting in her eyes. The 5 a.m. call she had predicted was still hours away, but she could feel it coming. She could feel the gears of the machine grinding into motion, the vast, invisible network of intelligence and power that had owned her for nearly 2 decades. She sat down in the chair and waited. She didn't turn on the TV. She didn't listen to music. She just sat in the dark, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the door. She was a woman who knew how to wait. She had waited for days in spider holes in the mountains of Tora Bora. She had waited for hours in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. She knew that time was just another tool, and she was the one who knew how to use it. Across town, in a hotel room near the base, Dominic Hale was also waiting. He had watched the younger Rangers fall into a fitful, alcohol-induced sleep, their bodies bruised and their egos shattered. He was sitting at the small desk, his laptop open, staring at a screen that was filled with redacted files and access-denied warnings. He had been pulling threads for 3 hours, using every backchannel and contact he had cultivated in 15 years of service. He had found nothing. No Rachel Kane. No record of a woman matching her description in any Tier 1 unit. It was as if she didn't exist. But then he found it. A single grainy photograph from a joint exercise in Jordan 6 years ago. It was a group shot of a multinational task force, most of the faces blurred by the sensors. But in the back, standing in the shadow of a Humvee, was a woman. She was wearing a shemagh wrapped around her face, leaving only her eyes visible. Those eyes. Hale froze. He zoomed in on the photo, the pixels breaking apart as he pushed the resolution to its limit. They were the same eyes he had seen in the bar, cold, flat, and utterly certain. The caption of the photo simply read, Asset 7 Alpha, status, classified. Hale felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He wasn't just looking at a retired sailor. He was looking at a legend, a woman whose exploits were whispered about in the dark corners of the Special Operations Command. They called her the Warden, the woman who was sent in when the situation was so dire that the only solution was the complete and total erasure of the problem. He closed the laptop and rubbed his eyes. He thought about the coin on the bar. It hadn't been an act of charity. It hadn't been for the damage. It was a signal. A come and find me for the people who knew what they were looking for. And as the sun began to rise over the Pacific, casting a pale, gray light over the rain-soaked coast, Dominic Hale realized that the world was about to get a lot smaller. The phone on Rachel's table began to vibrate, its low hum echoing through the silent apartment. She didn't hesitate. She picked it up, her thumb sliding across the screen. "Kane," she said, her voice like gravel. "We need you, Rachel," the voice on the other end said. It was a voice she hadn't heard in 3 years, a voice that belonged to a man who lived in a bunker beneath the Pentagon. "The situation in Subic Bay has gone sideways. We have 3 missing, and the local authorities are compromised." Rachel looked at her reflection in the darkened window. She saw the bruise on her cheek, the small, fading mark of a world that didn't understand what it was dealing with. "I'm out," she said. "You were never out," the voice replied, cold and certain. "And after what happened at Delaney's tonight, you're the only one on the board who has the right profile. The coin was a nice touch, by the way, very old school." Rachel's grip on the phone tightened. "How do you know about that?" "We always know, Rachel. Now there's a car downstairs. It'll take you to Miramar. You have 2 hours. The line went dead. Rachel sat in the silence for a moment longer. She thought about the garden she wouldn't start. She thought about the book she wouldn't finish. Then she stood up, walked to her closet, and pulled out a duffel bag that had been packed since the day she arrived. She didn't look back as she walked out the door. She didn't look back as she descended the stairs and stepped into the black SUV that was waiting at the curb. She just looked straight ahead, her eyes already recalibrating for the mission, for the violence, for the life she could never truly escape. The storm was finally beginning to break, the clouds parting to reveal a sliver of cold, morning sky. In the distance, the roar of the ocean was a constant, restless sound, a reminder that the world was always moving, always hungry, and always looking for the ones who knew how to survive in the dark. Staff Sergeant Tyler Mason would wake up that morning with a broken wrist and a story he would never tell. Dominic Hale would spend the rest of his career looking over his shoulder, wondering if the woman from the bar was still out there, watching from the shadows. And Rachel Kane would be halfway across the Pacific, a ghost returning to the machine, ready to remind the world why you never, ever slap a woman who sits alone in the silence. Hale lay on his back, fully dressed, his boots still laced tight as if he expected the floor to drop out from under him at any second. His phone sat face down on the nightstand, a silent, black slab that he hadn't touched in 3 hours. The ceiling of the motel room was unremarkable in every way, a sea of off-white popcorn texture and faint water stains, yet he stared at it with the focused intensity of a man trying to solve an equation that kept changing its variables. His mind was a restless engine, cycling through the events of the evening, but it kept snagging on the same jagged edge. It wasn't the fight itself that haunted him. He had been in enough bars and enough combat zones to know how a brawl worked. The fight replayed in his head with the relentless, sterile precision of body cam footage. He could see the arc of the punch, the shift of weight, the way the air seemed to hum with the sudden release of violence. Every detail was sharp, slightly unreal, like a high-definition recording played at half speed. He didn't even linger on the coin, that heavy piece of metal she had dropped like a challenge or a calling card. Instead, he kept coming back to her eyes. He remembered the way she had looked at Tyler after the slap. It wasn't the look he expected. There was no rage there, no flickering heat of anger, and certainly no fear. It wasn't the wild, jagged adrenaline that combat veterans learn to recognize as the precursor to total chaos. It was something far more unsettling. It was a stillness, an absolute, pressurized silence of someone who had assessed a complex situation, found it entirely manageable, and was now simply deciding exactly how much force the problem required to be neutralized. He'd seen that look only once before. It was years ago in Kandahar. He had been pulling security when a man walked alone through a Taliban-controlled checkpoint. The man had his hands loose at his sides, moving with a terrifying lack of urgency, and he had talked his way through to the other side before anyone even had time to realize they should have shot him. That man had been a Tier 1 operator, a ghost whose actual identity Hale had never been cleared to know. Seeing that same expression on a woman in a dive bar in San Diego made the hair on the back of Hale's neck stand up. He snorted softly, the sound loud in the quiet room, and sat up at exactly 4:47 in the morning. He reached for his phone, the screen's glow biting into his adjusted vision. He didn't dial Tyler. Tyler wouldn't understand, not yet. Tyler was still drowning in the stage where humiliation felt like the only dominant experience, and men in that stage don't think clearly, they only react. He didn't dial any of the other team members either. Instead, he scrolled through his contacts until he found a number he hadn't used in 2 years. The contact was listed only as Carver. He was a former 75th Ranger Regiment intelligence liaison who had transitioned into a role he described only as administrative. Hale understood that to mean something considerably less administrative and considerably more clandestine than a desk job. The phone rang 4 times, the rhythmic electronic pulse echoing in the small room. Then a voice, gravelly and alert despite the hour, came through the line. "This better be something," the voice said. No greeting, just the immediate demand of a man who didn't like his sleep interrupted without cause. "Carver, I need you to run something for me," Hale said, his voice low. There was a pause on the other end. "Hale, do you know what time it is?" "Almost 5. I know. Run it anyway." Another pause followed, longer this time. Hale heard the rustle of sheets and the heavy thud of feet hitting a floor. It told him that Carver was already more awake than he was letting on, the professional instinct overriding the civilian fatigue. "What am I running?" "Unit insignia, Naval Special Warfare, very black," Hale said, leaning forward. "The coin has an eagle over a globe and anchor on the left, with a crossed rifle and pistol. Below that, there's a designation I couldn't fully read in the low light, but it looked like it started with DevGru adjacent framing. Maybe something even further back than that." The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't the silence of a bad connection. It was the silence of a man who was suddenly very careful about what he said next. "Where did you see this coin?" Carver asked, his tone shifting into something sharper, more clinical. "It was left behind by a woman," Hale replied. "Mid-30s, maybe late. 5'6", lean, dark hair." She moved like Hale paused, trying to find a word that wasn't poetic but was still accurate. He settled on the only one that fit, like water. Like everything she did was the only correct option available at that moment. He heard Carver clear his throat. The quality of the silence changed again. It was the silence of a man who recognized a description he had heard in whispers but never expected to confirm. "Hale," Carver said slowly, "what did you people do tonight?" The question landed in Hale's chest like a stone dropped into a deep, still well. He felt the ripples of it all the way down. "What do you know, Carver?" "I'm not going to be able to verify this through any official channels," Carver said, his voice dropping an octave. "You understand that, right? Anything I find is going to be from the edges. Inference and pattern, not direct confirmation. If you're looking for a formal bio, you're calling the wrong guy." "I understand," Hale said. "Just tell me what moves on the edges." Carver breathed out slowly, a long, weary sound. "There's a name that circulates in the kind of circles where things circulate without ever being written down. A female operator. Genuinely an operator, Hale. Not support, not intel adjacent, not a cultural support team member. She was attached to a naval special warfare element that doesn't have a public-facing designation. She was embedded with SEAL units for classified direct action missions starting about 11 years ago. Her file, to the extent that any such file exists, is the kind of thing that makes very senior people go very quiet when you mention it." Hale's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles went white. "A name, Carver. Give me the name. Like I said, nothing official. But the name that moves with that description, the name is Kane." The room seemed to contract slightly around Hale. The air felt thinner, the shadows in the corners of the motel room deeper. "Kane," he repeated. "That means something to you," Carver stated. It wasn't a question. "Not yet," Hale said, his mind racing. "Tell me what else moves with that name." A long pause followed. Hale could almost hear Carver weighing the variables, calculating the risk of what could be said versus what was protected by a dozen different non-disclosure agreements and the unwritten laws of the community. He was sorting through what was rumor, what was documented reality, and what lived in that permanent gray space between them. "Syria," Carver said finally. "Something happened in Syria maybe 4 or 5 years ago. A classified direct action mission that went wrong in a very specific, very ugly way. Operational details don't exist in any format I can access, and believe me, I've looked. But the aftermath," Carver stopped himself, searching for the right phrasing. "The aftermath is what moved through the community. Someone was lost, someone very important. And the operator who carried that loss out of the theater reportedly went back into the field within 72 hours and completed the mission objectives." Hale closed his eyes, the image of the woman in the bar sharpening in his mind. "Alone?" he asked. "That's the story," Carver said. "Take it for what it is. Operator mythology has a way of growing in the retelling. It becomes a campfire story for guys who don't use campfires. And if it's not mythology, well, then you've got a different kind of problem." Hale didn't answer. He couldn't. Carver sighed. "Get some sleep, Hale, and a word of advice. Tell your people to be careful. Whatever happened tonight, if the name and the coin line up the way you're describing, you want to be very sure nobody does anything else stupid. You're playing in a different league now." The call ended with a soft click. Hale sat on the edge of the bed, the phone still in his hand, until the light outside the window began to change from the deep black of night to the bruised gray of early morning. He was thinking about Tyler. He was thinking about the look on Tyler's face when he'd been on the floor of that bar. That toxic mixture of confusion, wounded pride, and the early tremors of something that might eventually become real understanding if it was given the right kind of pressure in the right direction. He wondered if Tyler had the kind of character that could metabolize what had happened and come out stronger, or if the shame would just rot him from the inside out. He genuinely didn't know the answer. At 6:15, his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Carver. The notification was a formal alert from his command, a message from his battalion's training coordination officer. It was marked as routine, but the timestamp was 05:30. That meant somebody had been up very early doing administrative work that was not, in Hale's experience, typically done at that hour. The message was brief and clinical. Mandatory combat readiness assessment. All Ranger Battalion members currently in the San Diego Theater. Reporting time 0700. Location, classified training facility. Coordinates attached. Instructor, TBA. Hale read the message twice, then he read the timestamp again. 05:30, 2 hours after his call with Carver, an hour after he'd learned the name Kane. He didn't believe in coincidence, not in the military, and certainly not in this context. Everything was connected by a thread he couldn't see yet, but he could feel it tightening. He got up, pulled on his jacket, and went to knock on Tyler's door. Tyler answered in less than 30 seconds, which told Hale that he hadn't slept either. He looked terrible. His face was pale, his eyes were red-rimmed, and his wrist was wrapped in an ACE bandage. He'd clearly applied it himself from a field medical kit, the kind of rough, functional job that communicated both basic competence and a stubborn refusal to seek help. There was a quality to his eyes, a jagged, too-alert wakefulness that Hale recognized as the specific look of a man who had spent the entire night being a problem to himself. "We got orders," Hale said, his voice flat. He held up his phone so Tyler could read the screen. Tyler's jaw tightened as his eyes scanned the text. "Combat readiness assessment? Today, at 0700, Tyler handed the phone back, his movements stiff. "Who called this? This has to be above our pay grade. Get dressed," Hale said. "Wake the others." Hale started to turn away, but then he stopped. He turned back, looking Tyler directly in the eye. "Tyler. Last night, I don't want to talk about last night," Tyler snapped, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "I know you don't," Hale said, keeping his voice low and steady, devoid of the heat he felt rising in his own chest. "Listen anyway. What you did in that bar, I'm not going to dress it up for you. It was wrong. It wasn't just tactically wrong or strategically wrong. It was morally wrong. You understand the difference?" Tyler said nothing, but he didn't look away. "And that woman," Hale continued. "We need to talk about who she might be before we walk into that facility." Something shifted in Tyler's expression. It wasn't fear, but it was the first real intrusion of genuine awareness into a space that had previously been occupied entirely by ego and adrenaline. "You found something?" "Enough," Hale said. "Get dressed." They arrived at the facility at 06:50. All 7 of them piled into 2 vehicles, driving in a silence so thick it was almost suffocating. The location was a classified training compound about 20 minutes inland from Camp Pendleton. It was the kind of place that didn't exist on any public map, surrounded by high fences and staffed at the gate by men who didn't exchange pleasantries. They had all been there before for various joint training exercises, so the setting wasn't unfamiliar. It was common for Rangers to rotate through for specialized combat simulations. What was unusual was the receiving officer. Standing at the entrance to the main briefing room was a Navy commander named Briggs. Hale had never met him, but his reputation was substantial in the community. Briggs had the kind of face that seemed to have stopped aging decades ago, skipping the middle years and arriving directly at a weathered, silver-haired authority. He held a clipboard and watched them approach, assessing each of them with the patient, clinical gaze of a man who had long ago decided that first impressions were merely data points. "Rangers," Briggs said. It wasn't a greeting. It was just a statement of fact. Commander Hale replied, stepping forward as the ranking member. "Can you give us the operational parameters for today's assessment?" In a moment, Briggs said, making a mark on his clipboard. "You're all here. Good." He looked at the group with a bit more attention, his eyes lingering on Tyler's bandaged wrist and the faint bruising on Fowler's face. "Long night?" Nobody answered. The silence was their only defense. "Right," Briggs said, his voice dry. He pushed the heavy briefing room door open. Inside, the room was a standard military briefing space, rows of metal chairs, a projection screen, white walls, and that particular institutional smell of floor wax and stale coffee. They filed in and took seats without being told, the automatic response of soldiers who knew the drill. Briggs stood at the front, but he didn't open with the usual pleasantries. "You've been assigned to a joint combat readiness assessment with a naval special warfare instructor attached to an operational advisory unit," Briggs began. Duration: 5 days. Content: urban warfare simulation, psychological endurance evaluation, and joint force integration assessment. He clicked a remote, and the projector hummed to life. A single name appeared on the screen in stark black letters. "Your primary instructor begins in approximately 3 minutes. The name on the screen was Lieutenant Commander Rachel Kine, Usan Ret, Special Operations Combat Instructor. The silence that followed was a physical thing. It was the specific, heavy silence of 7 men having the same realization at 7 different speeds. Tyler's hands went flat on his thighs, his fingers digging into the fabric of his trousers. Hale looked toward the door. One of the younger Rangers, Specialist Fowler, the one who had hit the floor first the night before, made a soft sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a curse. "Sir," Hale said, his voice carefully controlled. "Is there a possibility the instructor assignment could be reviewed?" Briggs looked at him with zero expression. "No. On what grounds would a review?" "There are no grounds," Briggs interrupted. "The assignment stands." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Is there something about this assignment I should be aware of, Sergeant?" The pause that followed contained multitudes. Hale's mind raced through the calculations. He could disclose what had happened the night before, essentially reporting his own team's misconduct before someone else could, and try to control the narrative. Or he could say nothing and walk into a room with a woman who had every reason to break them. He thought about the coin. She had left it on purpose. She had known exactly who they were, and she had made a deliberate choice to let them sit with the knowledge of her identity. She was letting them stew in it. She already knew they'd be here. "No, sir," Hale said. "Nothing." Briggs nodded once, a sharp, final movement. "Then we're ready." He turned toward the side door. "Commander Kine?" She walked in. She was in full tactical gear now, dark, fitted, and bearing the quiet precision of equipment selected for function rather than appearance. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, severe knot. Her face was composed, professional, and entirely neutral. The bruise at the corner of her mouth was visible, a small, dark mark that served as a loud reminder of the previous night. Nobody in the room could look at her without feeling the weight of it. She stood at the front of the room and looked at them, her gaze sweeping over the row of chairs. Nobody looked away. Nobody spoke. The air in the room had the texture of the second before a thunderclap. Then Rachel Kine spoke. Her voice was calm, clear, and carried absolutely no theatrical weight. "Yesterday, you made a mistake about what kind of person I was," she said. "That's your first lesson." She let one beat of silence fall, allowing the words to sink in. "Assumptions in the field cost lives, not hypothetically, specifically. I have stood at the grave of a man who died because the people around him made an assumption about what the situation was and stopped looking for what it actually was." She took one step forward, her boots silent on the linoleum. "My name is Rachel Kine. I have 17 years of naval special warfare service. I have conducted direct action operations in 7 countries, 4 of which I cannot name in this room. I have been the last person standing in situations where that outcome was statistically improbable." She took another step. "I am not here to humiliate you. I want to say that clearly at the start because what comes next is going to feel like humiliation. But that's not its purpose." She looked at Tyler. It wasn't a long look, no longer than she looked at anyone else, but it was an even, deliberate moment of contact. It was professional and clean, which somehow made it worse than if she had glared at him. "Its purpose," she continued, looking back at the group, "is to show you what you don't know. Because what you don't know right now could get every person in this room killed within 60 seconds of contact in a real environment." She paused again. "Do you believe me?" Silence. "Staff Sergeant Mason," she said, her voice sharpening. Tyler straightened involuntarily. "Ma'am, do you believe me?" She waited. She had the patience of someone who understood that the right kind of silence was more effective than any shouting. She let it fill the room, let it work on Tyler until he had no choice but to answer. "Yes, ma'am," Tyler said finally. His voice was different than it had been the night before. It was still controlled, Rangers were always controlled, but there was something under the surface now, something that felt like the first pressure fracture in a sheet of ice. Rachel nodded once. Good, then let's begin. What followed over the next 4 hours was the most systematically disorienting training evolution any of them had ever experienced. And these were men who had been through the best training the military had to offer. It started with an assessment exercise that Rachel described as routine, a basic urban navigation problem. They were to locate a simulated objective in a mock city environment built across 3 acres of the facility's training ground, using only the information provided in their briefing documents. 7 Rangers, standard loadout, 20 minutes. They went in confident. They were Rangers. They owned the night and the day. They came out 12 minutes later having achieved 0 of the 3 objectives. Rachel was waiting for them at the exit. She held a stopwatch and looked at it before looking at them. She didn't say anything for a moment that stretched into an uncomfortable eternity. "Where did you lose the first objective?" she asked. Hale, who had been leading the stack, answered, "We had a route conflict at the 3rd intersection. 2 team members had different map interpretations." Who were the 2 members? Fowler and a ranger named Castellano raised their hands. Rachel looked at them, her expression unreadable. "You had different interpretations," she said. "What did you do?" Castellano answered, "We deferred to the team leader's call. How long did that take?" "Maybe 45 seconds. "In 45 seconds, Rachel said, her voice rising just enough to command the space. "At a real intersection in a real threat environment, every person within visual range of your position has had time to reassess, reposition, and make a final decision about your lives." She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "Go again." They went again. This time they lost 2 of the 3 objectives. Rachel's response was the same. There was no anger, no mockery, just questions. Precise, targeted, surgical questions that forced each man to locate exactly where his thinking had gone wrong. She wasn't telling them they were bad. She was forcing them to see their own mistakes. The effect was unsettling. It was impossible to blame her for how uncomfortable it felt because she was only holding up a mirror to their own choices. By the 4th iteration, they were finally getting one of the 3 objectives. By the 6th, they reached 2. It was Hale who noticed the pattern first. He stopped during the debrief and looked at her. "You're not adjusting the problem," he said. "The problem is exactly the same every time. You're watching us learn." Rachel looked at him, and for the first time, something shifted in her expression. It wasn't quite approval, but it was the specific attention of a professional who has heard something worth noting. "Yes," she said. "Why?" "Because the most important thing a soldier can do," she said, "is accurately assess his own performance in real time. Not after the fact. During," she looked at the group. "Most of you do your learning after contact. You debrief, you analyze, you adjust for next time. That's valuable, but it's also sometimes too late. I want you learning while you're in the middle of the fire." Tyler had been quiet throughout the entire evolution. He had executed his tasks with technical competence. He was a ranger, after all, but he had been quiet in a way that Hale kept tracking from the corner of his eye. It wasn't a sullen quiet, it was a processing quiet. At the lunch break, Tyler sat apart from the others in the small mess hall. Hale brought his tray over and sat across from him without asking. "Don't," Tyler said, staring at his food. "I'm just eating," Hale replied. They sat in a silence filled only with the ambient noise of the facility. Then Tyler spoke, his voice low, not looking up. "She's better than us." Hale considered how to answer that. He decided the truth was the only thing that would work. In some things, yes. In most things. Tyler pushed a piece of meat around his tray. "I keep trying to find the places where she's not. I was watching her all morning, specifically looking for the seam, the flaw." He paused. "That bothers me more than what happened last night." "Why?" "Because last night I was drunk and I made a decision I can explain, even if I can't excuse it." Tyler finally looked up. "This morning I've been sober and sharp. I've been watching one of the best tactical minds I've ever seen, and I can't find the ceiling. I can't find where she stops." He shook his head slowly. "Where does she stop, Hale?" Hale thought about Carver's voice on the phone at 5 in the morning. He thought about Syria and the legend of the operator who went back in after 72 hours. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I think that's the point." Tyler looked at him. "She's not just teaching us skills," Hale said. "I think she's teaching us the attitude, the thing underneath the skills, the thing that makes you keep going when the math says you should stop." Something moved through Tyler's face, a flicker of something that looked like resolve. He looked back down at his tray, his wrapped wrist resting on the table between them. a physical fact that wasn't going anywhere. "I owe her something," he said quietly. "You owe her a lot of things, I know." A long pause followed. "I don't know how to, not yet. Not today," Hale agreed. "Today you just work." Tyler nodded. "Just work." Across the room, Rachel Kynes sat at a small table by herself. She had a bottle of water and a worn tactical notebook. She was writing in it in small, precise handwriting. She didn't look up, but she had heard them. Her hearing, like everything else about her, was tuned to a higher frequency. She wrote one final line in the notebook after Tyler's words and then closed it. The line she'd written was, "Mason, possible." The afternoon of day one ended with nobody eliminated but nobody feeling like a victor. Rachel told Commander Briggs afterward that it was exactly where she expected them to be. Not because they were bad soldiers, but because they were proud ones. And pride, in her experience, was the last thing to break and the first thing that needed to. Day two started at 4:45 in the morning. There was no alarm, just Rachel's voice coming through the facility intercom at a volume calibrated to be impossible to sleep through, but not quite loud enough to be a formal wake-up call. She read coordinates, grid references, and a rendezvous time of 0500, nothing else. Hale was dressed and moving in 4 minutes. The others took between 6 and 9. Tyler took 3. They assembled at the coordinates, a staging area on the north edge of the training compound, to find Rachel already there. She was geared up, her expression neutral, holding 7 manila folders. She handed one to each of them without speaking. Inside each folder was a single sheet of paper. On it was a name, a role, and a set of behavioral parameters. At the top, in bold type, were the words, "You are no longer Rangers. You are now a mixed civilian-military extraction team operating in a denied environment," Rachel said, her voice cutting through the morning chill. "You have 48 hours. Your objective is on page 2. Fowler flipped the page. "This says our objective is to extract a compromised intelligence asset from a hostile urban environment while evading a pursuit element." He looked up, squinting against the rising sun. "Who's the pursuit element?" "Me," Rachel said. The word landed like a heavy weight. "Just you?" Castellano asked. He said it carefully, like a man testing the ice before stepping onto it. Rachel looked at him with the cold patience of a predator. "Just me. Against 7 of you," she checked her watch. "Your head start is 15 minutes. I'd suggest using them." Nobody moved for exactly 2 seconds. The sheer audacity of the challenge hung in the air. Then Hale barked a command. "Go." And they went. What followed over the next 6 hours was the most comprehensively humbling experience any of those 7 Rangers would ever admit to. Most of them would never admit to it at all. They had assumed she would chase them. They had assumed pursuit meant she would come from behind, trying to close the gap. They were wrong. They moved through the mock city with practiced efficiency, leapfrogging intersections, maintaining 360-degree security, using every trick in the book to mask their trail. They were fast, they were quiet, and they were professional. But 2 hours in, as they reached the first extraction waypoint, they found a small orange marker sitting exactly where their asset was supposed to be. On the marker was a handwritten note, "Asterisk, you're loud. Check your 6. Asterisk, they doubled their security. They changed their frequency. They moved into the denser part of the mock city, a labyrinth of shipping containers and concrete ruins. They were sweating now, the pressure of being hunted by a single ghost starting to fray the edges of their discipline. Hale led them into a 3-story building, planning to use the elevation to scout. They moved up the stairs in a tight stack, weapons at the ready. When they reached the roof, they found another marker taped to the door. Asterisk, elevators are traps, so are rooftops. Asterisk, where is she? Fowler whispered, his voice tight with frustration. He scanned the surrounding buildings with his optics, seeing nothing but shadows and concrete. "She's not behind us," Tyler said, his voice realization heavy. "She's already where we're going." They spent the next 4 hours trying to outthink her, but it was like trying to outrun the horizon. Every time they thought they had found a secure route, they found evidence that she had already been there. A footprint in the dust that shouldn't have been there. A door left slightly ajar. A single spent casing left on a windowsill. She wasn't just hunting them, she was deconstructing them. She was showing them that their tactics, while perfect for a conventional battlefield, were predictable. She was playing a game they didn't know the rules to. By noon, they were pinned down in a basement, exhausted and arguably dead, 3 times over by the parameters of the exercise. Hale looked at his team. They were dirty, tired, and for the first time they looked genuinely rattled. Even Tyler, who had been moving with a grim intensity all morning, looked like he was at the end of his tether. "She's not playing fair," Fowler muttered. She's not playing at all, Hale corrected him. The door to the basement creaked open. It wasn't a tactical entry. There was no flashbang, no rush of boots. Rachel just walked in, her rifle slung casually. She looked like she hadn't even broken a sweat. She looked at them, her gaze lingering on their defensive posture. "You're all dead," she said simply. "How?" Castellano asked, his voice raw. "We cleared every corner. We had eyes on every approach. You cleared the corners you were taught to clear," Rachel said. "You looked for the threats you were trained to see. But you never once considered that the environment itself was the threat." She walked over to a small vent in the wall. "I dropped a simulated gas canister in here 20 minutes ago. If this were real, you would have been incapacitated before you even realized the door was a distraction." She sat down on a crate, looking at them not with disdain, but with a strange kind of empathy. "You're Rangers. You're the best at what you do. But what you do is high-impact, high-signature warfare. This," she gestured to the room to the shadows, "this is something else. This is the scalp and the shadow." Tyler stood up, his face tight. "Teach us." Rachel looked at him. The bruise on her lip was fading, but the memory of the bar was still there between them. "Teach you what, Mason? How to do what you do, how to be that." Rachel was silent for a long time. She looked at the 7 men, seeing the pride that had been broken and the raw potential that remained. "You don't learn this in 5 days," she said. "Then give us 5 days of a start," Hale said. Rachel stood up. Her expression didn't change, but there was a new energy in the room, a shift in the air. "Fine," she said. "Get up. We're going back to the start. And this time, stop thinking like soldiers, start thinking like ghosts." The rest of the day was a blur of movement and correction. She didn't just tell them what to do, she showed them how to see. She taught them about the baseline of an environment, the natural rhythm of a city or a space, and how to move within it without disturbing the beat. She taught them about the fatal funnel of human perception and how to stay in the blind spots of the mind. By the time the sun began to set on day 2, the Rangers weren't the same men who had walked into the facility that morning. They were quieter. Their movements were more deliberate. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a sharp, hungry focus. As they walked back toward the barracks, Tyler fell in beside Hale. "You think we can get there?" he asked. "Where?" "To wherever she is." Hale looked at the silhouette of Rachel Kine walking ahead of them, a shadow moving through shadows. "I don't know Tyler, but I think I'd rather be on her side than in her way." Tyler nodded, his hand instinctively going to his bandaged wrist. "Yeah," he said, "me too." The third day began not with a voice, but with a sound, the low, rhythmic thrum of a helicopter hovering somewhere nearby. They were out of their bunks before the sound had even fully registered. This time there were no folders, no briefings, just a single word painted in white on the tarmac of the staging area: "Run." And for the next 72 hours, that was exactly what they did. They ran through simulations that pushed them to the absolute limit of their physical and mental endurance. They were deprived of sleep, given minimal rations, and forced to solve complex tactical puzzles while under simulated fire. Through it all, Rachel was there. She was the ghost in the machine, the constant, invisible pressure that kept them moving. She was the one who found the weak link in their formation and exploited it. She was the one who whispered corrections in their ears when they failed, and the one who pushed them back into the fray when they thought they couldn't take another step. By the end of day 5, they were unrecognizable. They were gaunt, their eyes hollowed out by exhaustion, but there was a new clarity in their gaze. They moved as a single, fluid unit, their communication almost telepathic. The final evaluation was a repeat of the first navigation exercise. This time, they didn't just achieve the objectives. They cleared the entire mock city in 8 minutes, moving with a terrifying, silent efficiency that even Commander Briggs, watching from the observation deck, found remarkable. When they finished, they assembled back in the briefing room. It was the same room where they had sat 5 days ago, but the atmosphere was entirely different. There was no tension, no resentment, only a profound, shared silence. Rachel stood at the front. She looked at them, her eyes moving from man to man. "You've done well," she said. It was the first time she had offered anything resembling praise. But she continued, "Don't think for a second that this is the end. This was just an introduction. The real world doesn't have instructors, it only has consequences." She looked at Tyler. "Staff Sergeant Mason." "Ma'am," Tyler said, stepping forward. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. She tossed it to him, and he caught it with his uninjured hand. "It was the coin. Keep it," she said. "As a reminder." "A reminder of what, ma'am?" Tyler asked. That the moment you think you're the most dangerous person in the room is the moment you're most likely to die. She turned to Hale. "Sergeant Hale, ma'am, keep them sharp," she said. "They have the tools now. It's up to you to make sure they don't get rusty." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the group one last time, then turned and walked out the door. She didn't look back. The Rangers stood in the silence of the room for a long time. Finally, Fowler spoke, his voice a low whistle. "Man, she's something else." "Yeah," Hale said, his mind going back to the bar, to the coin, to the legend of the woman who went back in after 72 hours. "She really is." They walked out of the facility and into the bright, blinding sunlight of Southern California. They were tired, they were sore, and they were heading back to a world that didn't know what they had just been through. But as they climbed into their vehicles, Hale noticed Tyler looking at the coin in his hand. He wasn't looking at it with shame anymore. He was looking at it with a quiet, hard-earned respect. "Let's go," Hale said. And they drove away from the facility that didn't exist. 7 men who had learned that the most important weapon they carried wasn't the one in their hands, but the one between their ears. And that the most dangerous person in the room wasn't the one making the most noise, but the one who knew how to be a ghost. The geometry of the problem was deceptively simple on paper, but in the thick, suffocating humidity of the training compound, it felt like a labyrinth designed by a ghost. The Rangers had placed Rachel at the starting point, a fixed variable in their tactical equation, and they were the moving parts, drifting away into the safety of the brush. They had executed every textbook maneuver in their collective repertoire. They set up layered rear security, moving in a staggered formation that ensured no 2 men were ever exposed simultaneously. They used every counter-surveillance technique they knew, pausing to scan, doubling back on their own tracks, and utilizing the natural contours of the land to mask their silhouettes. None of it mattered because Rachel wasn't behind them. She was already in front of them, a predator who had memorized the forest before the prey had even arrived. She had spent 48 hours on the site before the exercise even began. While the Rangers were still in their bunks or prepping their gear, Rachel had been walking the paths with a granular precision that verged on the obsessive. She clocked every choke point, every building, and every slight incline in her mind, until she possessed a 3-dimensional model of the space so vivid she could navigate it in total darkness, or under the crushing weight of high-decibel noise. She didn't need to see them to know where they were going. She understood the tactical logic of the Ranger mind, their innate preference for the high ground, their instinctual movement toward defensible positions, and their predictable reliance on standard operating procedures. She hadn't just planned for their preferences. She had preoccupied the spaces where those preferences would lead them. Fowler was the first to fall, and the manner of his elimination was a psychological blow that resonated through the entire team. He was on rear security, transitioning between 2 positions of cover with the measured, rhythmic gait of a professional. His mind was entirely focused on the threat vector behind him, a linear expectation of pursuit. Then Rachel appeared from a lateral angle he hadn't even considered. She didn't lunge or shout. She simply materialized from the shadows of a cluster of oaks. Before Fowler could even process the movement in his peripheral vision, she had him on the ground, a silent hand signal indicating he was eliminated. He sat there, stunned, not just because the rules of the exercise demanded it, but because the suddenness of her appearance had triggered a primal, ancient response in him. It was the kind of fear that bypassed training and struck at the reptilian core of the brain, the realization that something was there that should not be. She was gone back into the green before he could even reach for his radio. The radio traffic that followed was a masterclass in misplaced confidence. Castellano, receiving Fowler's muffled elimination report, declared the north perimeter secure. He spoke with the automatic, unearned certainty of a man who hasn't yet realized his entire security assessment is a relic of the past. 12 seconds later, the very frequency he thought was secure crackled to life. It wasn't a Ranger's voice. It was Rachel, speaking with a calm, instructional tone that was more unsettling than any taunt. "Castellano," she said, "your north perimeter is not secure. You have 2 exposed angles and 1 covered position you haven't checked because it requires moving backward." She paused, and the silence on the line was heavy with the sound of Castellano's own breathing. "Also," she added, "you're favoring your left side when you move. Old injury." Castellano's hand tightened on his radio, his knuckles turning white. "How are you on our frequency?" he demanded. "I've been on your frequency since 0512, Rachel replied. You didn't change it at the first position transition. Basic operational security. It's in the folder page 3, item 7. Change frequency at each major position transition. They hadn't done it. It was a small oversight, a tiny crack in the armor, but in Rachel's hands it was a crowbar. Castellano was eliminated 4 minutes later, caught in the very covered position he had failed to check. This was the element that began to erode their resolve. It wasn't just that she was physically superior or faster. It was that she was inside their heads. She kept talking to them through their own radios, her voice a constant, ghostly presence. She wasn't gloating. She was teaching while she hunted, pointing out the exact moment they'd revealed their positions, the specific habits they were relying on, and how she was exploiting each one. By the 4-hour mark, 4 of the 7 men were out. Hale, Tyler, and a ranger named Park were the only ones left standing. The 3 of them linked up in a heavily covered position at the heart of the compound. They went completely dark. Radios were switched off, movement ceased entirely, and they settled into the kind of absolute stillness that special operations training hammers into a soldier's DNA. They became part of the landscape, breathing shallowly, their eyes scanning with mechanical rhythm. It worked for 47 minutes. For nearly an hour, they were invisible. Then Tyler shifted his weight, a microscopic adjustment because his left knee had begun to ache with a dull, throbbing intensity. Rachel had been in a fixed observation position just 12 meters away for the previous 31 minutes. She hadn't moved a muscle, her breathing so controlled it barely registered. She noted the micro-movement of Tyler's knee and instantly recalculated his exact coordinates. But she didn't strike. This was the part that would later haunt Tyler the most. She had the position, she had the moment, and she could have ended the exercise for all 3 of them in 60 seconds. Instead, she waited. She waited another 19 minutes, allowing them to believe in their own invisibility. She let the silence work on them, letting it become a weight they had to carry. Hale felt it first. As the most experienced member of the group, he had developed a sixth sense, a sensory ghost that didn't have a name but was never to be ignored. It was the feeling of being watched, not just seen, but watched with intention. There is a profound difference between being a data point in someone's field of vision and being the target of their focused will. Hale placed a hand on Tyler's arm and held up 2 fingers, the silent signal that someone was here. Tyler froze. Park on Hale's other side mouthed a single word, "Where?" Hale shook his head. He didn't know. He could feel the pressure of her attention, but he couldn't find the source. That gap between feeling and knowing was the exact psychological space Rachel had designed this exercise to expose. Finally, Tyler made a choice. Later, Hale would reflect on this as the first real decision Tyler had made during the entire evolution. It wasn't a reaction or a default setting. It was a choice born of assessed information rather than ego. Tyler reached for his radio and flipped the switch. "Kane," he whispered. There was no response for 10 long, agonizing seconds. Then the radio hissed. "Mason," she said. "You've had us for a while," Tyler stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she replied. "Why haven't you moved?" The silence that followed had a different texture than the ones before. It was thick with the weight of her decision-making. Rachel, hidden just yards away, was deciding how much honesty this moment deserved. "Because you went dark and held your position correctly," she said finally. "That was the first time today that any of you defaulted to discipline instead of instinct. I wanted to see if you'd hold it." Tyler swallowed hard, processing the implications. "How long were you going to wait?" he asked. "As long as it took for you to break," she replied. "And if we didn't," Rachel paused again, "then I would have given you the objective, because a team that can hold discipline under pressure is a team worth giving ground to. But you broke by turning the radio on." Tyler looked down at the device in his hand, feeling its weight like a leaden stone. "Yeah," he admitted. "Why did you do it?" Rachel asked. Tyler thought about the easy answers, the tactical excuses he could manufacture. But he realized that after 3 days of Rachel Kane, the only thing worth giving her was the truth. "Because I needed to know if you were there," he said. "Not where you were, just if you were." "That's fear," Rachel said. Her voice wasn't accusatory, it was a clinical diagnosis. "It's not the bad kind of fear. It's the kind that tells you something is wrong before your eyes can see it. But you let it override your discipline. In a real environment, Mason, that kills you." "I know," Tyler said quietly. Then, after a beat, he added, "Yes, ma'am." The title came out differently this time. It wasn't the rote response of a soldier to an officer. It was an acknowledgement of an authority that had been earned through sheer, undeniable competence. The exercise was over. Rachel's voice over the radio returned to its level, professional tone. Mason, Hale, Park, exercise concluded, returned to the staging area. They walked back in a heavy, contemplative silence, picking up the 4 eliminated Rangers along the way. When they reached the staging area, Rachel was already there, perched on a field case, writing in a small notebook with the same terrifying focus she brought to everything else. She didn't look up when they arrived. "Debrief in 10, she said simply. The debrief lasted 2 hours, a grueling mental marathon that none of them had expected. Rachel spent more time analyzing the failure than she had spent executing the hunt. She didn't offer generalities or broad critiques. She went person by person, locating the precise second where the error had entered the system. For Fowler, it was his lateral threat axis, a conditioning gap in his peripheral assessment that she had identified within 5 minutes of watching him move. For Castellano, it was the frequency error, but she went deeper, explaining that his real mistake was a reliance on communal verification rather than independent checking. In a compromised information environment, that habit created a cascade of failure. When she reached Tyler, she paused. In a debrief that had moved with the efficiency of a scalpel, the 2-beat silence felt like a physical weight. "Mason, your error was the radio call," she said, her eyes locked onto his. "But your error before that was assuming that going dark was the final move. You treated stillness like an answer. It's not an answer, it's a question. What do you do when stillness isn't enough?" Tyler didn't look away. "Find another move," he said. "Find another move," she confirmed. "You can't outweigh a patient enemy by simply being patient. You have to change the frame of the problem." She closed her notebook with a sharp snap. "You almost did that. The radio call was an attempt to change the frame. The execution was flawed, but the instinct was correct." Hale, sitting nearby, watched Tyler's face and saw something shift, the quiet, internal movement of a compass needle finding a new, truer north. The atmosphere changed at 1900 hours. Commander Briggs had called Rachel into his office, and the walls were thin enough that Hale, waiting in the corridor, could hear the tension radiating through the wood. Briggs's voice was weary. "Washington is asking about the Syria file," he said. Rachel was silent for a long moment. "Then who's asking?" she asked, her voice low. "The same people who always ask when they think enough time has passed for the answer to change," Briggs replied. What followed was a silence so profound it seemed to suck the air out of the hallway. When Rachel spoke again, her voice was at a register Hale had never heard, a quietness so intense it was the sound of someone holding back a tidal wave. "Tell them the answer hasn't changed," she said. "It won't." Briggs said something Hale couldn't catch, and Rachel's response was like a hammer blow. "If they want to open that file, they open it without me. I don't revisit the dead for political convenience." The door swung open, and Rachel walked out, nearly colliding with Hale. She looked at him, her expression perfectly composed, but that very perfection revealed the immense effort it took to maintain. They stood there for 2 seconds, an eternity of unspoken questions. "Get some sleep," she said, her voice taut. She walked past him, leaving Hale alone in the corridor with the weight of what he'd heard. Syria. A file. The dead. He realized then that Rachel didn't just carry her expertise, she carried a history that had become structural to who she was. He went back to the bunk room and said nothing. Some things were too heavy to share. Day 3 began at 0430, not with a loud intercom, but with Rachel herself entering the bunk room and snapping on the overhead lights. "Up now," she said. "Something's changed." There was a new density to her voice, the sound of a woman operating on a razor-thin margin. Within 4 minutes, the Rangers were assembled. "Today's exercise has been modified," she announced. "You are no longer the extraction team. You are the compromise. An asset you were protecting has been captured. Your mission is recovery, but your opposition is a full Tier 1 adversary element I've brought in from the outside." The room went cold. "These are active-duty SEAL unit personnel," Rachel continued. "They have been briefed to treat this as a real-world problem." "Real contact protocols?" Hale asked, his voice steady. "Modified force markers only," Rachel said. "No live engagement, but communication intercept, physical restraint, and full psychological pressure are authorized. They will use everything they have. So will you." Castellano asked the question they were all thinking. "And you?" "I'll be coordinating," she said. What she didn't mention was that she would be coordinating for both sides. By 0643, the exercise was a disaster for the Rangers. 3 of them had already been restrained and moved to a holding area. By 0715, the remaining 4 had split into pairs and gone to ground on the east side of the compound. At 0722, Tyler's radio crackled. "Mason," Rachel's voice said, "don't move." He froze instantly. There are 2 SEAL operators in the building north of you. They've been waiting 40 minutes. They know you're in the area, but they don't have your exact position yet. You have 90 seconds before the team to your east completes the sweep and boxes you in." Tyler's brain went into overdrive. "You're telling me this?" he whispered. "Yes," she replied. "Aren't you supposed to be on their side?" "I'm coordinating both sides," Rachel said. "Right now, I'm deciding you need this information. Use it in the next 60 seconds or it becomes worthless. What do you do?" Tyler looked at Park, who had heard the exchange through the earpiece. Park's eyebrows were raised in a silent query. Tyler thought back to the debrief, to the idea of changing the frame. "North Building," Tyler said. "We don't avoid it. We go through it." Park stared at him like he was insane. "2 operators are waiting for us," Tyler said rapidly. "They're set up for perimeter engagement. They aren't expecting internal contact, because nobody goes toward the thing they are afraid of." He was already moving, pulling Park with him. "We go in, through, and out the north side. We'll be behind them before they even know the perimeter is broken." The radio was silent for 3 heartbeats. Then Rachel's voice came through, a single word: "Go." The next 4 minutes were a blur of technical precision. Tyler and Park moved with a terrifying lack of ego, applying every lesson of the last few days. They breached the building, slipped through the gaps in the SEAL's internal coverage, and exited the north side. They reached the objective and completed the recovery sequence while the 2 operators outside were still staring at the empty woods. When the debrief began, the SEAL coordinator, a lieutenant commander named Watts, looked at Tyler with genuine respect. "I've run this scenario 40 times, Watts said. "Nobody has ever gone through that building." Tyler looked at Rachel. She was writing in her notebook, but she spoke without looking up. "He changed the frame," she said. That night, Tyler sat on a low concrete step outside the barracks, his wrapped wrist resting on his knee. He heard the door open and knew instinctively who it was. Rachel sat down beside him, leaving a deliberate 2 feet of space between them. They watched the dark tree line together for a long minute. "I'm sorry," Tyler said. Rachel didn't answer immediately. "I know," she said. "I don't mean about the training," Tyler clarified, turning to look at her profile. "I mean about the bar, what I did. There's no version of it that's defensible. Why did you do it?" Rachel asked. Tyler searched for the easy answers, the alcohol, the ego, the pressure of the team, but he discarded them. He owed her the truth. "Because you made me feel small," he said, "and I didn't know what to do with that except try to make you smaller." The honesty of it seemed to hang in the cool night air. Rachel turned to him. "Do you know how many times someone has tried to make me feel small?" she asked quietly. "I can imagine," Tyler said. "No," she replied, "you can't. But you did the most damage you could access in that moment, and that damage was a slap. That tells me something about your limits. A man without limits reaches for a weapon. You reached for humiliation. That means somewhere in you a line still exists. The work is finding where that line belongs." She stood up and handed him her notebook. "Page 11, she said. "Read it. Give it back in the morning." Tyler opened the notebook under the dim light of the doorway. It wasn't a diary, it was a record of truths. On the left were dates, and on the right were single sentences. They were notes she had written to herself over years of service. He read the entries, feeling the weight of each one. The last entry, dated just 3 weeks prior, read, "The mission was never the missions. The mission was always the people. Remember that now that you have time to remember things." Tyler sat there for an hour, realizing that he was no longer the man who had walked into that bar 3 nights ago. The distance between who he was then and who he was now felt like a canyon he had finally learned how to cross. He returned the notebook at 0515 the next morning, placing it on the briefing table with the spine aligned perfectly with the edge. When Rachel arrived, she saw it, tucked it into her pocket, and looked out the window for 30 seconds of private contemplation. Day 4 was different. There was no gear, no field exercise. She had them sit in a circle in the briefing room. "Today we talk," she said, pulling a chair around to sit backward. "Talk about what breaks you, not the official answer. The real one." She started by telling them about Daniel Reeves. Reeves had been her spotter, her partner through 4 deployments. She knew the rhythm of his breathing better than her own. She knew the difference between his silence of focus and his silence of fear. She told them about a mission in Syria, about a 42-second window that had redefined her life. They were in an observation post, a position that had been compromised by a shifting local militia. Reeves was on the glass, and she was on the trigger. The air in the room seemed to vanish as she spoke. She described the heat of the Syrian sun, the metallic tang of the air, and the impossible choice she had to make. They were surrounded, and the extraction was minutes away, but the militia was closing in on a group of non-combatants they were sworn to protect. Reeves had looked at her, and in that look she saw the end of the mission. He had suggested a distraction, a move that would draw the fire away from the civilians and toward their own position. It was a suicide play, a way to change the frame at the cost of the operator. Rachel's voice remained steady, but the intensity in her eyes was shattering. She described the 42 seconds it took for the decision to be made and executed. She described the sound of the incoming fire, the way the light changed when the extraction bird finally appeared, and the weight of Reeves's body as she tried to pull him toward the ramp. "I made the decision to let him make that move," she said. "And for 4 years, I have lived in the space between whether that was the right tactical choice or the ultimate failure of a partner. That is what breaks you, not the enemy, but the weight of the choices you make when there are no good options left." The Rangers sat in a silence so heavy it felt like it might collapse the room. Rachel wasn't just a teacher anymore. She was a survivor of the very psychological pressures she was preparing them for. She looked at each of them, her gaze lingering on Tyler. "The reason I am here," she said, "is because I don't want your first impossible choice to be the one that destroys you. I want you to have the discipline to carry it. The training isn't about being perfect. It's about being functional when the world isn't." By the end of the 4th day, the dynamic of the team had fundamentally transformed. They weren't just a unit of soldiers. They were a group of men who had been dismantled and reconstructed with a new understanding of their own vulnerabilities. The bravado was gone, replaced by a quiet, lethal competence. As they prepared for their final evaluation, Tyler found himself standing near the equipment lockers, checking his gear with a focus that was no longer about proving himself, but about honoring the process. Rachel walked through the room, her presence still commanding, but the sharp edges of her authority had been tempered by the shared honesty of the previous days. She stopped next to Hale. "You're leading the final movement," she said. Hale nodded. "Yes, ma'am, and Mason?" she asked, looking toward Tyler. "He's my shadow," Hale replied. Rachel offered a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval. "Don't let the shadow get lost in the dark," she said. The final evolution was a full-scale simulation that combined every element they had learned. It was a grueling, 12-hour mission through the most difficult terrain the compound had to offer, against an opposition force that was twice their size. But this time, the Rangers moved differently. They didn't just follow the SOPs, they anticipated the gaps. When they hit a choke point, they didn't push through with brute force, they changed the frame. When communication was jammed, they didn't panic. They relied on the discipline of the stillness they had practiced. Tyler moved with a fluidity he hadn't known he possessed. He was no longer thinking about the steps. He was the movement itself. He found himself in a situation similar to the one that had broken him on the first day, pinned down with the threat coming from an unknown angle. But instead of the primal fear that had paralyzed Fowler, he felt a strange, cold clarity. He didn't reach for the radio. He didn't look for a way out. He looked for a way to change the problem. He signaled to Hale, a series of complex hand movements that dictated a flanking maneuver no textbook would have recommended. It was risky, unconventional, and perfectly executed. They reached the final objective point with minutes to spare. As the all-clear signal echoed through the training grounds, the Rangers stood together, exhausted, covered in mud and sweat, but possessed of a new kind of gravity. Rachel was waiting at the finish line. She didn't offer a speech. She didn't hand out medals. She simply looked at the line of 7 men and said, "You're ready." As they boarded the transport that would take them back to their home base, Tyler stayed back for a moment. He saw Rachel standing by the gate, her notebook in her hand, looking out toward the horizon where the sun was just beginning to set. He walked over to her, his heart rate finally beginning to settle. "Thank you," he said. Rachel didn't look at him, but she didn't turn away either. "For what?" she asked. "For the notebook," Tyler said, "and for the slap." Rachel finally turned to him, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Don't mention the slap in your report, Mason. It's bad for the paperwork." "I won't," Tyler promised. He hesitated, then asked, "What happens to the Syria file?" Rachel's expression went flat, the wall going back up. "The file stays where it is," she said, "but the people in it, they stay with me." Tyler nodded, understanding now that the weight she carried wasn't a burden she wanted to lose. It was the foundation of her strength. "Take care of your team, Mason," she said, her voice softening just a fraction. "That's the only mission that matters in the end." Tyler climbed onto the transport, taking his seat next to Hale and Castellano. As the vehicle pulled away, he looked out the rear window. Rachel Kine was still standing there, a small, solitary figure against the vastness of the training grounds. She looked like someone who had seen the end of the world and decided to keep walking anyway. The Rangers sat in the back of the truck, the silence among them no longer heavy, but solid. They were different men than they had been 4 days ago, forged in a fire that Rachel had lit and tended with a surgeon's precision. They had learned that the most dangerous weapon they possessed wasn't the rifles at their sides, but the minds that controlled them, and the discipline to know when to hold still and when to change the frame. The road ahead was long, and the missions waiting for them would undoubtedly be harder than anything they had faced in the woods. But for the first time in their careers, they felt like they finally knew how to carry the weight. The truth, as it finally emerged in the cold, unyielding light of the briefing room, was that the technology had been compromised in a way that neither Rachel nor her team had been able to detect before the fatal contact was made. It was a ghost in the machine, a flaw buried so deep in the encryption that it only revealed itself when the stakes were at their absolute highest. In that split second of realization, she had made a call. It wasn't a call based on a manual or a predetermined flowchart of tactical responses. It was the only call the moment offered, the kind of decision that training, experience, and every raw operational instinct she possessed pointed to as the singular path forward. It was the call that saved the mission. It was the call that saved her own life. But it was not the call that saved Reeves. She had carried him out herself. It was a 4-kilometer trek through a threat environment so hostile and dense that her subsequent after-action report would eventually describe it in the dry, depersonalized language of operational documentation. To the bureaucrats in Washington, it was a tactical extraction under duress. To Rachel, it was the longest and most hauntingly silent 4 kilometers of her existence. She could still feel the specific, heavy drag of his weight across her shoulders, a physical burden that was punctuated by the irreversible knowledge of what his silence actually meant. Every step was a negotiation with gravity and grief, moving through the shadows of a world that wanted them both dead. When she told the story to the 7 men sitting before her, she did it without a shred of drama. There were no histrionics, no trembling of the voice, no seeking of sympathy. That was the very thing that made every man in that room go completely still. It wasn't just the story itself, which was objectively devastating, but the flat, factual, almost clinical way she delivered it. It was the voice of someone who has narrated a tragedy so many times inside the echo chamber of their own mind that the words have been worn smooth by repetition. The edges that used to catch on the soul had been filed down by the sheer frequency of the memory. When she finished, the room was so quiet you could hear the distant hum of the facility's ventilation system, a low, industrial drone that suddenly felt deafening. Then Hale spoke, his voice breaking the spell. He mentioned that she went back into the field a mere 72 hours later. Rachel's eyes moved to him, her gaze steady and unreadable. There was a pause, a brief moment where the air seemed to thin. She didn't ask where he had heard that. In her world, information was the only currency that mattered, and she knew better than anyone how it traveled. She simply waited, letting the silence ask the question for her. "Does it matter?" Finally, she nodded. Yes, she confirmed. She had gone back because the mission wasn't complete and the people it was designed to protect were still at risk. Her voice faltered then, but only for exactly 1 second. It was the way a massive steel girder bridge will move slightly in a high wind, not a sign of weakness, but a proof that it isn't so rigid that it will snap. She told them that Reeves would have gone back too. She insisted that her return wasn't an act of courage. It was an act of loyalty. She wanted them to understand that there is a profound, fundamental difference between the two. Fowler, who was only 23 years old and had seen the world through the lens of a single deployment, sat leaning forward. His understanding of grief was still largely theoretical, something studied in books or heard in hushed tones at bars. He asked if they hadn't wanted her to stand down after something like that. Rachel admitted they had strongly recommended it. When Fowler pressed further, asking if she wasn't a liability, emotionally speaking, the question landed with the accidental, bruising bluntness of youth. 2 of the older Rangers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to Rachel to see if she would take offense. But she didn't react with anger. Instead, she looked at Fowler with the same intense, focused attention she gave to every genuine question. She told him it was the right question to ask. And then she gave him the honest answer. She didn't know. She believed she was functional. Her performance metrics on that follow-up operation were within normal parameters, but as to whether she was actually whole inside, she pressed her lips together, a brief, rare sign of internal struggle. She admitted she had thought about that for 4 years and still didn't have the answer. The honesty of that admission hit the room harder than any boast of mission success ever could. Here was a woman whose entire professional identity was built on the pillars of competence and absolute control, and she was sitting in front of 7 elite soldiers, admitting that she might have been broken in a way she couldn't even measure. Tyler had been quiet through the entire exchange. He sat with a particular kind of stillness, the sort of posture held by a man who is doing significant internal work and knows that any sudden movement might disrupt the delicate architecture of his thoughts. He finally asked her why she was telling them all of this. Rachel looked at him, her eyes locking onto his. She told him it was because they were all going back out there. Another deployment, another theater, another set of missions that would inevitably put them in rooms where the person standing next to them was the only thing between them and a decision they could never take back. She leaned forward, her presence filling the space between them. She needed them to understand, not academically, not as a piece of training doctrine to be memorized and recited, but in their bodies and their guts, what it truly costs when ego enters that room. She wanted them to know the price of mistaking personal certainty for correctness. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. She told them that Reeves didn't die because she was wrong. He died because the situation was wrong, and she was the person who had to navigate it. But she had spent 4 years asking herself if there was a version of her, a more disciplined version, a version without the blind spots she hadn't found yet, that would have seen what she missed. Her voice stayed level as she told them she didn't want to be the story they told each other about someone else's failures. She wanted them to find their own blind spots now in the safety of this facility, where the cost of a mistake was merely discomfort instead of a row of body bags. The silence that followed was different from the ones that had come before. It wasn't the silence of men waiting for a lecture to end so they could go to lunch. It was the silence of men actually thinking, a heavy, transformative quality of quiet. Then Park spoke up. He didn't ask about tactics or tech. He asked for the name of her spotter, his full name. Rachel looked at Park for a moment, and for a second her professional veneer softened. She told them his name was Daniel Aaron Reeves. He was from Nashville. He had a daughter named Claire who would be 9 years old now. She shared the small, jagged details that make a person real. How he made the best terrible coffee you've ever tasted. How he read history books with the intensity most people reserved for television, and how he could fall into a deep sleep anywhere in under 4 minutes. She admitted she had both hated and envied him for that last part. As she spoke, the specificity of these details, the coffee, the books, the 4-minute sleep, brought Daniel Reeves into the room. He was no longer just a casualty in an after-action report. He was a person. 3 of the 7 men in the room immediately thought of their own partners, the specific and irreplaceable individuals whose quirks and habits they had cataloged without even realizing it. They thought of the people who had become as familiar to them as their own reflections in a dusty mirror. None of them said this out loud. They didn't need to. The air in the room had changed. The bond between the instructor and the students had shifted from one of authority to one of shared burden. The second half of that 4th day was physical in a way the previous days had not been. It wasn't a field exercise or a complex simulation. Rachel took them down to the facility's training floor, a vast expanse of industrial mats and cold air. She ran them through a series of hand-to-hand combatives that were less about the mechanics of a strike and more about the psychology of physical contact under extreme pressure. The exercise she set for them was simple and brutal. 2 people in a confined space, no strikes allowed, purely positional control. The goal wasn't to pin the opponent in a flashy display of dominance, but to continuously maintain a superior position regardless of what the opponent did. Rachel explained that this required the same mental architecture as any sustained operational pressure. You couldn't rely on a single, static solution. You had to stay present, adaptive, and perpetually willing to abandon what was working the very moment it stopped being effective. She matched herself against each of them in turn. She wasn't there to demonstrate her superiority, but to demonstrate the principle itself. Each engagement lasted 90 seconds. In every single one, she gave ground deliberately at least twice. She let them believe they had secured a dominant position, let them settle into a false sense of security, and then moved in a direction they hadn't covered because their minds had already decided the problem was solved. When she finished with each man, she asked the same question. "When did you stop looking for my next move?" The answers varied in the details, but the substance was always the same. They all stopped looking the moment they thought they had her. That was the pattern she was trying to break. Success in the immediate moment often creates the perfect conditions for the next failure, because success tells the brain that the conflict is over. Tyler went last. When he stepped onto the mat, something had already shifted in his demeanor. The previous 3 Rangers had gone in with the controlled aggression of elite athletes, but Tyler was quiet and slower. He looked like he was thinking about something other than the physical struggle. Rachel noticed the change but said nothing. They made contact, and the struggle began. Tyler gave ground early and deliberately, refusing to fight for an immediate position. He let Rachel set the geometry of the fight and then moved inside it, making himself harder to categorize as a threat because he wasn't behaving like one. Rachel felt the non-standard rhythm of his movements and recalibrated her own approach. 40 seconds into the round, Tyler moved into a position that was tactically suboptimal, a mistake a trained person shouldn't make. Rachel's hands adjusted automatically to take the advantage he had seemingly offered. In the quarter-second of that adjustment, Tyler shifted his entire body. He didn't try to counter her move. He used the momentum of her own counter to reposition himself entirely. He landed at an angle that wasn't dominant, but it wasn't controllable either. She looked at him, surprised. He was breathing steadily, his face wearing an expression she hadn't seen before. It wasn't the smirk of someone who had scored a point, but something much quieter. It was the look of someone who had applied a difficult lesson and found that it actually worked, and who was now more interested in the why than the how. He told her he had changed the frame. Rachel nodded, stepping back and putting some space between them. She asked where he had learned to think like that. After a pause, Tyler told her the truth. He had learned it by watching her. A brief, fleeting emotion moved through Rachel's expression, perhaps pride, perhaps a deep-seated weariness, and she nodded once. That was when Commander Briggs appeared at the edge of the training floor. The expression on his face was enough to erase every other thought in the room. Rachel saw him and immediately straightened her posture, the instructor persona snapping back into place. Briggs walked toward her, his voice low but carrying enough for at least Hale and Tyler to overhear. He told her that the Syria inquiry in Washington had escalated. They were sending a deposition team. They wanted a formal, on-the-record statement regarding the Reeves mission. Rachel's face went through an eerie transformation into total blankness. The absence of reaction was, in itself, a profound reaction. It was the specific, hollowed-out expression of someone who has just received the news they have been both expecting and dreading for years, and who no longer has the energy to pretend otherwise. She noted that they would be arriving in 2 days, right during the final exercise. Briggs held her gaze, suggesting that the final exercise could be rescheduled. Rachel didn't hesitate. She told him there was no window for a delay. It would not be rescheduled. Briggs reminded her that this was a formal government inquiry with subpoena authority, but Rachel remained unmoved. She told him they could wait until she was done. These men had 3 more days of training that they needed in order to go back into the field safely, and she refused to cut that short. She told him to schedule the deposition for after the exercise, and if they didn't like it, she'd talk to a lawyer. Briggs pressed his lips together, his eyes searching hers. Then he dropped the other shoe. He told her the inquiry wasn't just about the Reeves mission anymore. The silence that followed lasted 2 full seconds. When Rachel asked him to repeat that, Briggs looked at the Rangers standing at the edge of the mats. Some were looking away, trying to give their superiors privacy, while others were failing to hide their intense interest. Briggs lowered his voice even further. He explained that there was a secondary element. Someone inside the intelligence architecture of that mission had come forward with an alternate account of the 40-second window where everything went wrong. They were suggesting that the decision Rachel made wasn't a real-time tactical call, but a pre-planned operational choice. They were suggesting that Reeves' position was not accidental. The room held its breath. Rachel stood perfectly still. The color hadn't left her face. She was far too controlled for that, but something deep in her eyes changed. Hale, watching from 20 feet away, recognized that look. It was the look of a person encountering something truly unrecoverable. It wasn't fear or anger. It was the raw, foundational shock of a person whose most private, agonizing grief has just been handed back to them as a political weapon. She told Briggs that wasn't what happened, her voice quiet and dangerously level. Briggs said he knew that, but that wasn't the point of the inquiry. When she asked what the point actually was, Briggs explained that the mission she completed after Reeves' death, the secondary objective, had yielded results that someone in Washington had decided were significant enough to examine. They wanted to classify the methodology, or even worse, attribute it retroactively. They wanted to discredit the account of what happened in that 40-second window to make room for a different narrative about why the mission was run the way it was. Rachel stood with that information for 3 long seconds. She realized then that they were going to use Daniel to do it. They were going to use a dead man who couldn't speak for himself to justify a lie that suited their current political architecture. Briggs didn't answer because the answer was written all over his face. It was yes, and he didn't want to say it out loud in front of her students. Tyler took a single step forward before his discipline caught him. He knew it wasn't his place, but the impulse was there. Rachel noticed. She noticed everything. She looked at him briefly, acknowledging the impulse without requiring an explanation, then turned back to Briggs. She demanded 2 days. After the final exercise, she would give them their deposition. Briggs, a man who had seen enough of the world to know the difference between stubbornness and necessity, saw the necessity in her eyes. He gave her the 2 days and left the floor. Rachel stood at the center of the training mats for about 10 seconds, doing nothing visible, but clearly processing something massive internally. It was perhaps the most significant thing she had done all week. Then she turned back to the group. She told them that tomorrow would be the final exercise, a full-scale night operation. Everything they had learned would be tested in one continuous sequence. She asked if there were any questions. Nobody spoke. She nodded, telling them to get rest, with dinner at 1800 and lights out at 2100. She picked up her jacket, her movements precise. She was almost to the door when Fowler called out to her. The 23-year-old, who only days ago wasn't sure he had anything to learn from her, stood up from his bench. He told her that whatever they were saying about Syria, whatever that inquiry was about, they had been listening when she told them about Reeves. He gestured to the rest of the group, a small motion that included all of them in a silent pact. He told her that none of them in that room believed the lies they were trying to tell. Rachel looked at Fowler, then at the others. She simply said, "I know," and then she was gone. The door closed, leaving the 7 Rangers in the training room with the collective weight of what they had just witnessed. Hale leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Castellano turned away, lost in his own thoughts. Park sat with his hands folded, staring at the floor. Tyler walked over to the water station, pouring himself a cup and drinking it while staring at the door Rachel had just exited. He thought about the notebook he had seen. Page 11, an entry from 3 weeks ago. The mission was never the missions. The mission was always the people. He thought about Daniel Reeves from Nashville, about his daughter Claire, and about a woman who had carried the irreversible weight of a dead friend for 4 kilometers, and then gone back to work because other lives were still on the line. And now, some suits in Washington wanted to reach into that darkness and rearrange her grief to suit a story that had nothing to do with the truth. Tyler set his cup down and looked at Hale. He asked what they knew about the inquiry. Hale looked at him carefully, asking why he wanted to know. Tyler's voice was steady as he explained that Rachel was going to walk into that deposition in 2 days with no support structure, forced to testify about the worst moment of her life in front of people who had already decided on the ending. He said there had to be something they could do about it. Hale was quiet for a long time before mentioning a name, Carver. Tyler nodded. Carver. Park looked up, asking who Carver was. Hale explained that he was someone who knew things and who owed him a favor. He was already reaching for his phone, telling the group to give him an hour. The room shifted around that decision. It wasn't a loud declaration of war, but the quiet alignment of 7 men who had been systematically taken apart and rebuilt over the last 4 days. They had found a reason to apply their new understanding of protection, and that reason was standing right in front of them in the form of a grave injustice. While the men inside were making their plans, Rachel was walking the perimeter of the compound in the dark. She walked for 40 minutes, not for exercise, but because her mind needed the rhythm of motion to work through things that didn't have clean edges. She thought about Daniel. She always thought about him when the inquiry came up, not because it clarified anything, but because he deserved to be remembered by someone who knew the real version of him. He deserved a witness who remembered the coffee and the history books every time the political version of his death was brought into a room. She didn't know what the Rangers were doing inside, and she didn't need to. She only knew what she had written in her notebook on a lonely night 3 weeks ago. The mission was always the people. She stopped walking and took a long, deep breath of the cold night air. When she let it out, she didn't feel any lighter, and she was okay with that. Some weights you don't put down, you just learn how to carry them so your hands stay free for the work that remains. She had one more day to give these men everything she had, and then she would go to Washington and do the same for Daniel. Inside the facility, Hale's call to Carver lasted 22 minutes. It ended with Carver promising to make some calls. He didn't elaborate, and Hale didn't ask. He knew that when Carver said he'd make calls, things started to move. Tyler sat across the room, listening to Hale's side of the conversation without interruption. When it was over, Hale told him they might have something, not a guarantee, but a possibility. He explained that there might be someone with access to the original operational file, someone who had been present during the initial after-action review, who might be willing to go on the record and state that the new narrative didn't match the documented facts. Tyler asked if Carver could find that person. Hale replied that Carver already knew who it was. The only question was whether they would be brave enough to speak. Some people had stayed quiet for 4 years because it felt like the safe choice. Sometimes all it takes is for the right person to ask the right question, and if they wouldn't speak. Hale was quiet for a moment. He said that if they wouldn't speak, Rachel would walk in there alone, but they would make sure she knew they had tried. Neither man said it out loud, but they both understood the gravity of it. Rachel Kine had spent years walking into difficult rooms alone, and they were perhaps the first people she had helped who weren't going to let her carry that burden by herself. At 2100 hours, the lights in the bunk room went out, but sleep was elusive. The facility was filled with the restless energy of people thinking too hard. By 0300, more than half the Rangers were awake, staring into the darkness. Tyler was one of them. He thought about the final exercise coming in just 3 hours. He thought about how the last 5 days had been a single, continuous transformation, each day adding a new layer that changed the meaning of everything that came before. He knew he wasn't the same man who had walked into that bar on Friday night. He didn't quite know who the new man was yet. He could see the outline of someone more honest, someone stripped of the old pretenses, but the identity was still forming. It was an uncomfortable feeling, the uncomfortable of becoming. At 0430, Rachel's voice crackled through the intercom. There were no coordinates this time, just a simple command. Final exercise. All personnel, staging area, 15 minutes. The Rangers dressed in silence, their movements synchronized and efficient. When they reached the staging area, they found Rachel standing with Commander Briggs and 2 others. They were civilians, or close to it, dressed in dark, neutral clothing. One was a man in his 50s with a military bearing he hadn't quite shed, and the other was a woman about Rachel's age, carrying a tablet and a recording device. Hale knew immediately who they were, the deposition team. They were early. Rachel was speaking to Briggs in a low voice, her back to the group. Hale couldn't hear the words, but the body language was unmistakable. The tension was thick enough to choke on. The deposition team stood off to the side, looking like vultures waiting for a signal. They represented a world of paperwork, politics, and retrospective judgment, a world that was currently crashing into the reality of the training environment. The Rangers stood in a tight formation, their eyes locked on Rachel. They were waiting for her lead, but they were also watching the newcomers with a cold, predatory focus. The atmosphere in the staging area had shifted from a training environment to something much more volatile. The air felt charged, like the moments before a massive storm breaks. Rachel turned then, her face a mask of professional resolve, though there was a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there the day before. She looked at her students, the men she had pushed, prodded, and broken down over the last few days. She didn't acknowledge the civilians. She only looked at the Rangers. "The objective is simple," she began, her voice cutting through the damp morning air. "But the execution will require everything you've learned. This isn't just a test of your physical capabilities. It's a test of your judgment under the worst possible conditions. You will be operating in a simulated, denied environment. Your communications will be intermittent. Your intelligence will be flawed. You will have to make calls in the moment, calls that you will have to live with for the rest of your lives." She paused, her gaze lingering on Tyler and Hale. There are people who believe that decisions made in the heat of a crisis are pre-planned. They believe that you can look back with the benefit of hindsight and find a better way. Today, you are going to prove them wrong. You are going to show them what it actually looks like to operate when the frame is constantly changing, and the only thing you can trust is the person standing next to you. The civilian man stepped forward slightly, as if to interrupt, but Briggs put a hand on his arm, a silent warning to stay back. This was Rachel's domain, and for the next few hours, the rules of Washington didn't apply here. Rachel ignored the movement and continued her briefing. She laid out the parameters of the exercise, a complex multi-stage operation involving a high-value target extraction and a subsequent escape through hostile territory. It was designed to be impossible to complete perfectly. It was designed to force them into the same kind of impossible choices she had faced in Syria. As she spoke, Tyler felt a surge of cold clarity. He realized that this exercise wasn't just for them. It was a demonstration. Rachel was using the final exercise to show the deposition team exactly what real time looked like. She was going to force them to witness the chaos, the speed, and the crushing weight of the decisions these men had to make. She was turning the training floor into a courtroom, and the evidence was going to be the sweat and blood of the men she had trained. "Gear up," Rachel commanded, her voice like iron. "We move in 5 minutes." The Rangers scrambled to their equipment, but there was a different energy in their movements. They weren't just training for their next deployment anymore. They were training for Rachel. They were training for Daniel Reeves, and they were training to protect the truth from the people who wanted to bury it under a mountain of bureaucratic lies. Hale caught Tyler's eye as they checked their comms. There was a grim understanding between them. They were about to go into the dark, and they were going to make sure that whatever happened, the people watching from the sidelines wouldn't be able to look away. The civilians from Washington stood by the wall, their tablets ready to record every mistake, every hesitation. They were looking for evidence of failure, for proof that Rachel's methods were reckless or compromised. But as the Rangers moved toward the transport vehicles, they didn't look like men who were going to fail. They looked like a cohesive unit, a single organism built of 7 different parts, all moving with a shared purpose. Rachel stood at the edge of the staging area, her silhouette sharp against the rising sun. She looked like a woman who had finally found the frame she needed to win. She looked like a woman who was no longer walking into the room alone. The engines of the transports roared to life, a deep, guttural sound that shook the ground. The final exercise had begun, but the real battle was already well underway. As the vehicles pulled out of the compound and disappeared into the gray morning mist, the facility felt suddenly empty, the silence returning with a vengeance. But it was a different kind of silence now, not the silence of grief or regret, but the silence of the hunt. Inside the back of the lead transport, Tyler checked his sidearm one last time. He looked at the men around him, Hale, Fowler, Park, and the others. He saw the same look on all of their faces. They were ready. They were the people Rachel had written about in her notebook. They were the mission. And today they were going to make sure the mission succeeded, no matter what the cost. The transport bounced over the rough terrain, the world outside a blur of shadows and light. Tyler closed his eyes for a second, picturing the hillside in Syria, picturing the 4-kilometer walk Rachel had endured. He could almost feel the weight of it, the crushing, silent burden. But when he opened his eyes, he saw the men in the transport with him, and he knew they were carrying it together now. The weight hadn't disappeared, but it was being shared, and that made all the difference. The vehicle came to a sudden halt. The rear doors hissed open, revealing a world of darkness and uncertainty. Rachel's voice came through the headsets, sharp and clear. "Green light, go." They stepped out into the night, 7 men moving as one, disappearing into the trees before the dust from the transport had even settled. Behind them, back at the facility, the deposition team waited in their air-conditioned room, their screens ready to catch the first sign of a mistake. They were waiting for a story they had already written. They didn't realize that the story had already changed. They didn't realize that they weren't the ones in control of the narrative anymore. The truth was out there in the dark, and it was moving faster than they could ever hope to follow. The morning air at the training compound was thick with more than just the usual humidity and the scent of damp earth. There was a secondary layer to the atmosphere, a localized pressure front that centered on the small group gathered near the staging area. Rachel was shaking her head, a sharp, rhythmic movement of her jaw that signaled an absolute lack of flexibility. Commander Briggs was standing in front of her, his posture that of a man trying to navigate a minefield without a map, his voice lowered to a tone of desperate reason. He was asking her to reconsider, to look at the larger picture, but Rachel's answer remained a flat, unwavering no. It wasn't an emotional refusal, it was a structural one. The man in his 50s stepped forward then, breaking the circle. He moved with the slow, calculated grace of a career politician or a high-level litigator, someone who viewed every social interaction as a deposition. "Lieutenant Commander Kane," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration of intent, the verbal equivalent of placing a firm hand on a closing door to keep it from locking. Rachel turned slowly. She looked at him without a shred of expression, her eyes as cold and deep as the Atlantic in midwinter. "Mr. Hartley," she said. The fact that she knew his name told Hale everything he needed to know. This wasn't a fresh arrival. This conflict had been simmering in the background for longer than the 2 days the Rangers had been aware of it. It was a ghost that had been haunting the edges of the training cycle since the beginning. "We were hoping to begin preliminary statements this morning," Hartley said. His voice had the smooth, pressureless quality of someone who had spent decades getting exactly what he wanted through the sheer weight of his presence rather than through the use of force. He didn't need to shout, because the systems he represented did the shouting for him. Given the timeline, he began, but Rachel cut him off before he could finish the thought. "The timeline," Rachel said, "is exactly what I told Commander Briggs. The final exercise completes today. After that, I am available, not a second before." She turned back to Briggs without waiting for Hartley's response, effectively erasing the man from the conversation. "What's the operational setup?" she asked. Briggs, wearing the slight, weary expression of a man who was carefully choosing which battle he was willing to lose today, reached into his folder and handed her a briefing sheet. Hartley, unused to being dismissed so casually, tried one more time. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, his voice gaining a slight, sharp edge, "this inquiry has a congressional mandate. This isn't a request for your time, it's a requirement." "I understand perfectly well what it has," Rachel said. She still didn't look at him. Her eyes were scanning the briefing sheet, her mind already shifting into tactical mode. "And I will be there after the exercise is concluded." She lowered the paper and looked at him directly for the first time, and the intensity of her gaze was enough to make the man take a half step back. "You've been building this case for 4 years, Mr. Hartley. You've lived with it, breathed it, and used it as a stepping stone. I think you can manage to wait 6 more hours." Beside Hartley, a woman with a tablet made a quick, sharp note on the screen, her stylus clicking against the glass. Hartley didn't look at her. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the 7 Rangers standing at the staging area. His eyes moved across them with the detached assessment of a man cataloging variables, looking for a weak point or a piece of leverage. His gaze stopped briefly on Tyler Mason. Tyler didn't flinch. He met the man's eyes with a steady, unblinking stare that held no hostility, only a profound lack of interest in Hartley's authority. After a moment, Hartley looked back at Rachel. 6 hours, he said. It wasn't an agreement. It was a calculation. He was deciding if the friction of an immediate confrontation was worth the delay. Apparently, it wasn't. Rachel had already turned away. The final exercise briefing took exactly 11 minutes. Hale timed it on his watch, a habit born of years of operating in environments where seconds were the only currency that mattered. The scenario was a full-scale night operation across the entire training compound, a sprawling labyrinth of mock urban structures, dense wooded patches, and industrial skeletons. The 7 Rangers constituted a direct action team with a specific high-stakes objective. They were to recover a piece of intelligence, a sealed case, from a secure location at the compound's north end. But there was a catch. Standing between them and that objective was Rachel's network. It wasn't just Rachel alone this time. It was the full advisory unit she'd referenced back on day 38. These were active-duty naval special warfare personnel, operators who had been on site since 0200, positioned and prepared. It was 8 seasoned professionals against 7 Rangers. But Rachel had one additional parameter that she announced at the end of the briefing, and the way she said it, flat, factual, and devoid of drama, was somehow the most dramatic delivery possible. "I will be in the field," she said. "I won't be coordinating from a command center. I won't be watching from a drone feed. I will be on the ground. My objective is the same as my team's, to prevent your success." She paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in. "But I have one constraint they don't. I cannot be in more than one place at once. Use that. Fowler leaned in and whispered very quietly to the man beside him. She's going to be everywhere, he said. Castellano, the man beside him, didn't even turn his head. I know, he replied. They all knew. They had spent a week being dissected by this woman, and the idea of her being a singular, localized threat was a fantasy. She was a ghost in the machine, a presence that saturated the entire environment. They went in at 0500. The first 7 minutes were the quietest 7 minutes any of them had experienced in the history of the training compound. There was total darkness, save for the green-hued world of their night vision. There was total radio discipline. Most importantly, there was a total reliance on the individual skills and collective instincts that had been systematically rebuilt over 5 days of being taken apart by Rachel and her relentless, patient, and surgical method of instruction. They weren't just a group of soldiers anymore. They were a single organism, breathing and moving in sync. Hale led the first movement. He made the first decision, splitting the team into 3 distinct elements. He took a 3-man element toward the objective directly, moving slowly and using every concealment technique in the book. The other 2 elements, each consisting of 2 men, moved in parallel on the flanks. They didn't move toward the objective. In fact, they moved away from it in directions that made no tactical sense by traditional standards. Their goal wasn't to reach the target. It was to create noise. It was the frame change in action. Tyler's individual realization from days prior had been scaled up into a team tactic. Hale hadn't been sure it would work when they planned it in the darkness of the barracks. He wasn't entirely sure now, but he'd spent 5 days watching Rachel teach them that the correct instinct was always the one that changed the geometry of the problem. This was the only option they had that changed the geometry. The first contact came at minute 11. One of the SEAL operators found Castellano's element on the east flank. Castellano had planned for exactly this. He had no intention of winning the contact in a traditional sense. He didn't need a kill, he only needed to occupy the operator's time. He gave ground deliberately, drawing the contact deeper into the east side of the compound, pulling resources away from the center. The second contact came at minute 14 on the west flank. It was a similar story with Park's element. It wasn't a victory, and it wasn't an elimination. It was a managed, deliberate, attention-consuming engagement that pulled 2 more SEAL operators out of the objective corridor. The 3-man element, Tyler, Fowler, and a ranger named Reyes moved through the center, slipping into the gap that the flanks had opened with their calculated sacrifices. And then Rachel appeared. Tyler heard her before he saw her. It wasn't a sound, exactly. It was more the absence of a sound that should have been there. It was a micro-gap in the ambient noise of the compound, the rustle of wind through the grass, the distant hum of the facility that his nervous system registered before his conscious mind could process it. He stopped instantly, holding up a fist. Fowler and Reyes froze behind him. For 3 seconds there was absolute, suffocating stillness. Mason. Her voice came from his left. It was low, close, and dangerously calm. He turned his head slowly. She was standing 6 feet away, partially merged with the shadow of a rusted shipping container. She had been there in that position for at least the previous 45 seconds, watching them approach. She could have eliminated all 3 of them before they even knew she was there. Instead, she had chosen to announce herself. Tyler's mind raced. He needed to figure out why in the next 2 seconds, because in Rachel's world, every decision contained information. She wasn't announcing herself because she was feeling generous. She was doing it because she wanted him to respond to her presence. She wanted his attention on her, which meant the thing he actually needed to be looking at was somewhere else. "Don't look at me," he whispered to Fowler and Reyes. "Eyes out. Find what she's pulling our attention away from." Fowler reacted instantly. He turned away from Rachel, sweeping his gaze to the left. "Contact," he hissed. 1 operator north, 30 meters, static position. The operator was positioned perfectly in a static overwatch between them and the objective. He had been there all along, waiting for them to move through the corridor that Rachel had just opened by appearing on their left and pulling their eyes toward her. She had been the bait in her own trap. Tyler looked back at Rachel. She was still standing 6 feet away in the dark. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, but it wasn't hostility. It wasn't quite approval either. It was something neutral, something that hovered in the space between the 2. "You saw it," she said. "You showed it to me," Tyler replied. "I showed you a lot of things this week," she said softly. "You had to be the one to see them." The radio crackled in Tyler's ear. It was Hale, speaking from a position he hadn't announced to anyone except according to the pre-agreed timeline. Center element, you have a 90-second window on the east side of the operator's position. The flanks are holding, but they won't last long. Go now. Tyler looked at Rachel. She had not moved. She still had the legal authority within the exercise to formally eliminate him. She was within arm's reach, and she had clearly identified his position. According to the rules, she had the advantage, yet she remained still, a shadow among shadows. Why? Tyler asked. It wasn't a full question, just that one word, heavy with the weight of the week. She understood him perfectly. Because eliminating you isn't the point, she said. There was a long pause, the silence between them thick enough to feel. Surviving you is. It took Tyler 2 full seconds to parse that. When the realization finally hit him, it felt like a physical blow. She wasn't in this exercise to beat them. She was in it to see if they could beat themselves, the versions of themselves they had been at the start of the week. She had been structuring every moment, every lecture, and every grueling drill toward this specific outcome since 0600 on day 1. She was the mirror she had forced them to look into. Go, she said. Tyler went. He didn't look back. He took Fowler left, swinging wide around the static position and using the corridor that Hale's flanks had forced open. Reyes went right as a decoy, moving with deliberate visibility to draw the static operator's attention. It worked. Tyler and Fowler slipped around the left flank, their movements fluid and silent. They had 44 seconds left to reach the objective. Tyler's hands found the intelligence package, a sealed case the size of a hardback book, exactly where the briefing had said it would be. He gripped the cold plastic for 1 second, just one, a brief moment of tactile confirmation. Then a voice crackled over his radio. It wasn't Hale, and it wasn't any of the Rangers. Exercise concluded. It was Rachel. She was still on their frequency, just as she had been since the very first hour. Her voice, coming through the earpiece into the sudden silence of the compound, carried a different quality than it had all week. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, something more private. It was the sound of a person who had watched something she set in motion finally arrive at the destination she had intended. The formal debrief was held in the main briefing room at 0730. Commander Briggs ran the meeting, not Rachel. She sat at the very back of the room, her arms crossed, saying absolutely nothing. In many ways, her silence was its own form of communication, a heavy presence that filled the room more effectively than any speech could have. Lieutenant Commander Watts, who had been on site since day 3 and had watched the full arc of the week's training, gave the technical assessment. His verdict was precise and unambiguous. The team had completed the primary objective using a tactical methodology that had never appeared in any previous iteration of this specific exercise. He noted the frame change, the deliberate sacrifice of the flank engagements to create the central corridor, and the specific decision made in the field to look away from the apparent threat to find the real one. When he spoke that last part, he looked directly at Tyler. Tyler didn't react. He was too busy watching Rachel. She was focused on her notebook, her pen moving in small, controlled strokes. When the debrief concluded, Briggs dismissed the group. The Rangers filed out, their boots echoing on the linoleum floor. Tyler lingered. He stayed behind, the last person in the room besides Rachel, who hadn't moved from her chair at the back. She finished her note, closed the notebook with a soft click, and looked up to find him standing there. "The deposition," he said. "Today." "Yes," she replied. "Hale made some calls," Tyler said, stepping closer. "He found someone who was present at the Syria after-action review. They might be willing to provide a formal statement on your behalf." Rachel went very still. For a moment, it was as if she had stopped breathing. "Who?" she asked. "Hale's contact is still working on the details. We don't have a name yet, but Carver." Tyler paused, watching her reaction. "Hale trusts him." She held his gaze for a long moment, and for the first time, something moved behind her eyes. It wasn't the controlled, professional blankness she wore like armor. It was something more unguarded, the specific expression of a person who had been operating entirely alone for so long that the sudden appearance of unexpected support was a shock to the system. It took her a moment to process the fact that she wasn't standing on that line by herself anymore. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know this isn't your fight." "With all due respect, ma'am," Tyler said quietly, "you spent this entire week making it our fight. You made us understand that what happens to the person next to us is our fight by definition." He paused, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "I'm just applying the lesson." Rachel looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she did something he hadn't seen her do the entire week. She smiled. It wasn't the brief, controlled expression of professional acknowledgement she'd given him in the field. It was a real one, small, unguarded, and genuine. It appeared and disappeared quickly, like a flash of light through a shutter. "You graduated," she said. Tyler didn't know if she meant from the exercise or from something much larger. He had a strong suspicion she meant both. The twist that changed the trajectory of the entire day arrived at 0915, exactly 40 minutes before the scheduled deposition. It came in the form of Hale appearing in the doorway of the briefing room. He was holding his phone out, and his face wore an expression Tyler had never seen before. It wasn't shock, it was something past shock, something in the territory of a profound reckoning. "Carver called back," Hale said, his voice tight. Rachel looked at him, her entire body tensing. "The person who was present at the Syria after-action review?" Hale nodded, taking a breath. "It's not just one person, Rachel. It's 3. 2 intelligence officers and a naval officer who was part of the ground element that night." He paused, the silence in the room suddenly becoming heavy. "All 3 of them have provided sworn statements to a federal oversight office. Not to the inquiry, to a separate office. They're corroborating the original operational account. Your account." He lowered the phone, his hand trembling slightly. "The alternate version being presented by the inquiry, it doesn't match the documented record at any point. And now there are 3 people on the official record saying exactly that." The room fell into a stunned silence. The air seemed to vibrate with the magnitude of the news. Rachel stood there, her face a mask of concentration. "When did they provide these statements?" she asked. "Carver says the statements were filed this morning at 0700, Hale said. Tyler realized the timing immediately. They were filed before the deposition was even scheduled to begin. That meant someone had been moving on this for a long time. Someone had been preparing this defense for much longer than the past 24 hours. Carver had known this was coming. He had made calls that set things in motion that were already gaining momentum. The 2 days of Hale's questions, Tyler's determination, and the Rangers' collective refusal to let Rachel walk into that room alone had simply accelerated a landslide that was already building. Rachel stood up from her chair. She walked to the window and stood there for a long moment, her back to the room, looking out at the training grounds. Tyler and Hale waited in silence. When she finally turned back around, her face was back to its usual state, composed, controlled, and functional. But there was a new light behind her eyes. Something that had been under immense pressure for 4 years had just found its first genuine release valve. She looked at them both, her voice steady. "Daniel deserved better than 4 years of this," she said. Yes, Tyler agreed. He deserved better than being used as a political variable by people who never even knew his name. She looked at them both, and the weight of her next words was immense. "Thank you," she said. She said it the way she said everything, clean, direct, and without any theatricality, but the sincerity behind it was absolute. When Hartley was informed of the 3 corroborating statements at 0945, he did not react visibly. People who operated in the corridors of power he frequented had long ago learned the art of the poker face. They didn't show surprise when the evidentiary foundation of their case suddenly shifted beneath their feet. He thanked the briefing officer with a curt nod, made a phone call that lasted exactly 4 minutes, and emerged from that call with the expression of a man whose world had just become significantly more complicated. The deposition proceeded as scheduled. At 1000 hours, Rachel Kine walked into the hearing room in her full-service dress. Her back was perfectly straight, her hands were still, and the bruise at the corner of her mouth had faded but was still visible, a physical fact that existed in the room alongside every other piece of evidence. She answered every single question with a level of precision that was almost unnerving. She didn't qualify her answers, she didn't hedge, and she didn't engage in the careful diplomatic vagueness that people in her position often use to protect themselves. She told them exactly what had happened in that 40-second window in Syria. She told it with the same flat, factual directness she had used with the 7 Rangers in the briefing room. She spoke about the decision she had made, what that decision had saved, and exactly what it had cost. She spoke Daniel's name, and she said it clearly, her voice never wavering. Something in the way she spoke his name told everyone in that room that she had been saying it to herself every day for 4 years, and she had no intention of stopping now. When the inquiry team presented their alternate account, the version that suggested the entire incident had been pre-planned and that Reeves's position had not been an accident. She didn't change her expression. She looked at the document they placed in front of her, read it carefully, and then set it back down. "That account is false," she said. "It is false in every material detail. I understand there are now 3 corroborating statements on the record from personnel who were actually there or who reviewed the original documentation. I have nothing to add to what they've said because the truth doesn't require addition." She paused, looking at the inquiry officers one by one. "What I would like to say is this. Daniel Reeves was a decorated naval special warfare operator who performed his duties with distinction under circumstances that would have broken most people. He does not deserve to be misrepresented in a political process that has nothing to do with who he was or what he did. I ask that this inquiry extend to his record the same standard of factual honesty I have just extended to my own." She stopped talking then. The inquiry officer looked at her for a long, silent moment. Then he looked over at Hartley. There was a silent communication between them, the look of 2 men who were recalibrating their entire strategy in real time. The deposition concluded at 1200 hours. It would take 6 more weeks for the formal inquiry findings to be officially issued. When they finally arrived, the language was careful, governmental, and entirely unsatisfying as a personal vindication. However, it was definitive as a legal finding. The operational record of the Syria mission was ruled accurate as originally documented. No evidence supported the alternate account of the events. The finding also included a brief, dry paragraph acknowledging the service record of Daniel Aaron Reeves, a decorated operator killed in action. Rachel would read that paragraph 3 times when the email hit her inbox. She wouldn't cry. Instead, she would sit at her kitchen table for a long time, staring at the screen. Eventually, she would close her laptop and go make coffee. The coffee would be nothing like the terrible, wonderful coffee Daniel had made on every forward operating base they had shared across 4 countries and 4 deployments. She would drink it anyway, but that was 6 weeks in the future. On the day of the deposition, at 1300 hours, Rachel walked out of the government facility and into the bright afternoon sun. She found Tyler Mason leaning against the brick wall outside, dressed in civilian clothes, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. He held one out to her as she approached. She looked at the cup, then at him. "You waited," she said. "We all waited," Tyler replied. He gestured with his head toward the parking area. There, standing around 2 vehicles, were Hale, Fowler, Castellano, Park, Reyes, and the 7th Ranger, Webb. Webb had barely said a word all week, but he had absorbed every lesson with a quiet intensity. They were all standing there with the patient, unhurried quality of men who had nowhere else they needed to be. Rachel looked at them, all 7 of them, and then she took the coffee. It was not good coffee. It was gas station coffee from a place 3 blocks away that Tyler had found in the few minutes between the deposition ending and Rachel walking out. It was the kind of coffee that existed primarily as a delivery system for warmth, and as an acknowledgement that warmth was needed. She drank it anyway. They stood outside for a few minutes, the 8 of them, enveloped in the particular kind of quiet that follows a significant event, before whatever comes next has a chance to declare itself. Finally, Hale broke the silence. "What happens now?" Rachel turned the paper cup in her hands, looking down at the dark liquid. She thought about her apartment, the way it always felt like a held breath. She thought about the silence that had been pressing in on her from every wall for 3 weeks. She thought about the separation papers sitting on her kitchen table and the looming question of what her life was supposed to look like now. She looked at Tyler. "You're going back to your battalion." "Yes," he said, "and then deployment. Probably 6 months, maybe less." Rachel nodded once. She was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting back to the group of men who had stood by her. "I'm going to be teaching formally," she said. "The advisory unit has offered me a permanent position." She paused. "I wasn't going to take it. But you are now," Hale said, noting her use of the present tense. She looked at him. "I am." Tyler tilted his head. What changed? Rachel thought about how to answer that. She thought about page 11 of her notebook. She thought about the word possible that she had written next to Tyler's name 4 days ago. Most of all, she thought about Daniel, who had always believed that the mission wasn't the objective. The mission was the people. He had been right in a way that only becomes visible in retrospect. When you're standing outside a government building drinking bad coffee with 7 soldiers who waited 3 hours just to make sure you didn't have to walk out alone. "I was reminded why I started," she said quietly. The words landed with the weight of complete truth, needing no further explanation. Tyler looked down at his coffee cup. He'd been carrying something in his jacket pocket since 0600 that morning. He reached in and pulled it out, holding it in the center of his palm. It was his father's military challenge coin, the same one he'd had in his pocket that night at the bar. It was a coin that had once meant everything to him, but he had cheapened it along the way, becoming a man who confused his father's courage with his own entitlement to be feared. He held it out to Rachel. She looked at the coin, then up at his face. "My father's," he said. "He told me once that every man has two wolves inside him. One feeds ego, the other feeds honor. The one that wins is the one you feed." He paused, his voice steady but heavy with self-reflection. "I've been feeding the wrong one for a long time. I think you know that." He kept his hand extended. "I'd like you to hold onto this as collateral," he said, "so I have a reason to come back and earn it." Rachel looked at the coin for a long time. Then she reached out and picked it up. She held it between her fingers, turned it over once to feel the weight and the ridges of the metal, and then placed it in her jacket pocket right next to her notebook. She looked at Tyler with the expression of a teacher making a final assessment, one she intended to hold him to. "Then come back better," she said. It wasn't a wish or a platitude. It was a requirement. It was the kind of thing a real teacher says to a student when the lesson has been learned well enough to be trusted with something that actually matters. Tyler nodded once, a clean, sharp movement. He had two wolves inside him, and he finally knew their names. He knew which one he had been feeding, and he knew which one he was going to feed from this moment forward. That knowing, that honest, eyes-open realization, was the gift Rachel had spent 5 days trying to give him. Now it was his to carry. They finished their coffee in the quiet afternoon. The group began to break up gradually, the way groups do when the force that assembled them has fulfilled its purpose. One by one, the Rangers said their goodbyes and headed toward their vehicles. Rachel was the last one to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. She took out her notebook, turned to a fresh, white page and wrote a single line. She capped her pen and stared at the words for a moment. Then she started the car and drove toward whatever was coming next. She wasn't driving away from the weight she carried, because that weight was a part of her now, and she had finally made her peace with it. She was moving forward, the way a person moves when they finally understand that the mission isn't something that ends. The mission is never behind you. The mission is always the people who are still ahead.